Chapter 654. Alas! Why are you here? Brando asked a little guiltily. Didn't you go back to your clan? Thank goodness, the girl named Alas just snorted coldly and did not burn the place to the ground with a torch. She frowned and replied, It's done, so annoying. I heard you did something amazing, so I came back to see you, but I didn't expect to see someone's perverted scene. What perverted scene? Brando was stunned. Ahem. Miss Amandina coughed violently in the back, making people suspect that she suddenly had some serious illness or asthma or something like that. The little female dragon looked back and saw everyone staring at her with their mouths agape. She couldn't help but be very dissatisfied. What are you doing here? Can't you see that I'm going to talk to this guy now? I don't like being watched like an animal, especially by humans. That Buga mage over there. What are you laughing at? Are you not human? She snorted heavily. Get out of here. When she spoke in this tone, she clearly looked like a loli, but she looked like she took it for granted. That kind of arrogance seemed to be innate, and it didn't feel out of place at all. Especially when paired with her pair of majestic golden eyes, no one dared to look her in the eye. The golden bloodline was like a natural king, and such a knight naturally flowed out from her, more natural than a secular king. When did you get this habit? Brando was slightly startled. He remembered that this little female dragon did not have so many problems when they were in the forest. But his idiotic question was only met with a vicious glare. Then I'll leave this place to you, my lord. Miss Amandina looked at her lord with some sympathy, and could not help but shake her head, and was the first to leave with the others. After that it was Tulman's turn. The great scholar had a strange smile on his face and was not offended by the little female dragon's arrogance. It was probably because it was not the first time a silver person had dealt with a gold person. Only he could stand it. Finally, the two silver elves and Medisha bowed respectfully to Alas before leaving the room. Soon, only Brando and the little female dragon were left in the room. Of course, there was also the sleeping Roman. The little female dragon poked Romaine's soft cheeks with her finger, trying to wake her up, but she was quickly defeated. Woo-woo, Brando, take your paws away. Let me sleep for a while. Roman mumbled vaguely in his dream, and brushed Alas's hand away like she was brushing off a mosquito. Alas, on the other hand, seemed to have found a toy. She poked the Roman's face and said, Your fiancée is really fun to play with. Let her stay here. Don't treat others as toys without permission, Brando replied snappily, although Alas was also a female, oh no, a female dragon. But he was jealous too. The little Roman's face belonged to him alone. I didn't expect you to be so protective. He's just a pervert. The little female dragon simply let go of the Roman and sat down beside Brando. She casually picked up a grape from the crystal plate at the side, carefully peeled it, and then threw it into Brando's mouth. Is it good? Since when did I have this title? Brando chewed and stared at the little female dragon suspiciously. She was unaccountably solicitous, which gave him a very bad feeling. Although Alas was unlikely to have anything to ask of him, he always felt that this was the calm before the storm. Did he offend this guy in some way? He wondered in his heart. Naked in front of the opposite sex in the eyes of you humans is considered a pervert, right? The little female dragon replied matter-of-factly. F***ck. Brando almost spat out a mouthful of blood. He immediately thought of what the little female dragon was talking about, and hurriedly looked at the equipment panel, only to see that the elemental bracelet, flame ring, snake ring, flame star, flesh greaves, and all the amulets except the tears of lich all had an additional tag behind them, completely damaged, unable to repair. The rest of the other gold tier equipment were also in the damaged can be repaired status. Of all the items, only the magic breaker Halrangaya, and the dimensional cave were unscathed. At that moment Brando understood what had happened. He had withstood the Titan's attack, but unfortunately, the other equipment had been annihilated. The loss was so heavy that he could not bear to look at it directly. If the cultists did not give him enough compensation, this time it would be a huge loss. All the best equipment on him was destroyed. His equipment was almost the best equipment that he could get in the first chapter, and a few of them could even be said to be the super version. Some of the materials in his backpack and the rock core necklace had been turned to dust before he even used them once. Brando wanted to cry, but no tears came out. Fortunately, the 5-headed snake lizard egg and the order stone that could upgrade his territory were left in Valhalla, or else he would have really died. However, even these magical equipment could not be spared, and he did not expect his clothes to be intact under such intense lightning. Brando could not help but ask meekly, "Who was the first to come to my side?" "Of course it was me. You didn't see anything, right?" "Not much." The little female dragon smiled sweetly with evil intentions. Apart from a certain someone's entire body that was burnt black, and his eyebrows and hair were all burned away, how laughable. Oh right, apart from a certain someone's disgusting thing. Brando was so ashamed that he wanted to find a hole to hide in. Don't you know how to avoid it? It's obviously a girl. Avoid it? Now a certain someone is going to report to the kingdom of the dead. You're obviously weak as hell, yet you still don't know what's good for you. Alaz said sarcastically. Also, would you avoid a bald monkey? How can that be compared? I'm a human. In my opinion, there's no difference. The little female dragon replied matter-of-factly. Brando then remembered that the other party was a dragon, and could not help but feel a little hurt. Speaking of which, it seemed that the gold folk looked at the iron folk much more superior than humans looked at monkeys. So, Allah's words were actually giving him face. Of course, Brando did not want this kind of face. But what made him a little uneasy was that the little female dragon said that his hair and eyebrows were all burned away. He would not become bald, right? Although he did not care much about his image, that was a little too outrageous. Unexpectedly, the little female dragon seemed to have seen through his thoughts and snorted. "Don't worry, I've already brought it back for you. I don't want to have a pervert as a toy, I'm not that Wuxia." Brando did not know who Wuxia was, but she must be a hardcore person. Hearing that he did not become a skinhead, Brando finally breathed a sigh of relief. This was probably considered a blessing in the midst of misfortune. He sighed and said, "Thank you, Alaz, this is the second time you've saved me. It's okay, you can repay me by being a cow or a horse." "Don't even think about it," Brando thought to himself and at the same time asked, "Speaking of which, how did you save me? If I remember correctly, you dragons don't seem to have healing spells, right?" In his impression, the dragons were proficient in ancient string magic, known for their destructive power, but he had never heard of a dragon that was proficient in rebirth spells. Unless this guy was a freak. Actually, it's not that difficult. Alaz sat on the edge of the bed, peeled a second grape and threw it into her mouth and replied with a smile. "Although opening someone else's dimension hole is a little cumbersome." "Dimension hole? Wait, what did you say?" Brando immediately thought of something bad. He immediately opened the dimension hole to check, and found that the remaining bottle of holy water number 1 had disappeared without a trace. Brando was a little speechless for a moment. After all this time, this guy was just using someone else's flower to present the Buddha, but how did she know that he had holy water number 1? He could not help but stare at Alaz suspiciously. "Don't be so stingy, saving your life is more important, right?" The little female dragon comforted him casually. "Besides, do you think it's that easy to save you? I don't know what kind of ability you used, your body's functions are in a mess, but you're still alive and kicking. But it's going to be troublesome to save you. Especially when your heart function is completely failing." Alaz said proudly. "So I changed it for you." "What did you change it for me?" Brando suddenly had a bad feeling. "Well, the best choice is of course the heart of gold." The bad feeling suddenly turned into a burst of ecstasy. Brando asked loudly, "Wait, you mean the legendary heart of gold that will never be harmed, the indestructible heart of gold? The legendary heart of the golden race that truly has eternal life?" Brando's voice was almost trembling. The heart of gold had actually appeared in the game. Its attributes were that the maximum HP was doubled, its own defense was doubled, its HP recovery ability was increased by 300%, and the heart was no longer a vital part. The other 3 attributes were okay, but the last attribute was simply too overpowered when combined with his unyielding talent. At that moment, he simply wanted to jump up from the bed, hug the little female dragon and give her a big kiss. "Hey, you know quite well I'm talking about that. You changed that for me." Originally, Brando was still a little awkward about things like changing hearts, it did not matter in the game. But here he was a living person, he always felt that if he changed some parts, he would become a monster. "Of course not." Alaz shook her head. You don't expect me to have something ready-made, do you? Who would know that you break your heart for no reason? I had no choice but to stuff the Titan's lightning core into your body. Fortunately, that thing is pure energy, otherwise your little body would not be able to fit it in. Brando almost vomited blood. Damn, you can't mess around like this. He felt a burst of bitterness in his heart. It sounded like she was experimenting on him. Is there a human who uses a Titan's lightning core as a heart? Wouldn't that be replacing the blood in the blood vessels with electricity? He imagined himself being cut by a sword in the future, and the scene of lightning spurting out of the wound. He could not help but feel a chill down his spine. I say, why do you look so defeated, like you're about to die? Alaz immediately noticed Brando's abnormality. Are you doubting my skills? Brando stared at Alaz, the look in his eyes saying, I'm very doubtful. Damn it, why don't you check it out yourself? Brando was slightly startled. Originally, Alaz wanted him to try and feel his own physical condition. This was an ability that all powerhouses who had entered the elemental realm had, but Brando immediately opened his attribute panel. He found that his attributes were all normal, his health was very good, and his eyes swept over the mana value and mana recovery column, and suddenly he was stunned to find that it had more than doubled. More importantly, the originally high willpower attribute had increased by another notch at this moment. And there was an additional label, energy enhancement, behind it, obviously due to the lightning core. But in theory, the lightning core should belong to the equipment category, and Brando was a little confused that he did not find the existence of this thing in the equipment column before. He subconsciously opened the panel of the enhancement crystal, and was stunned. He saw that the undead night crystal was still lying quietly in the position of the arm enhancement slot, and there was a dazzling thing like the sun in the torso enhancement slot. Lightning core. Mana value, mana recovery doubled, willpower plus 20, wind elemental pool expansion doubled. There was a shiny golden label behind it. A fantasy enhancement crystal core. Brando was a little speechless for a moment, not knowing if he had profited from a disaster. Purely in terms of gains and losses, this crystal alone was completely worth the price of the equipment he lost. But the question was, what did he want to do with the expansion of the wind elemental pool? He seemed to have only 1 or 2 cards that needed to use the wind element. Brando was still in a daze when the little female dragon suddenly came over. When he came back to his senses, he saw a pair of sparkling golden eyes carefully looking at his face. Allah's action startled him. What are you doing? You have a lot of secrets on you. I just saw the fluctuations of the elements. You were checking your elemental pool, right? It's strange, you haven't activated your elemental activation. How did you do it? The little female dragon stared at him with burning eyes. And before, you were so badly injured, you should have died in an instant. That's weird. Aren't you going to explain? Explain what? Brando asked guiltily. How could he explain that the NPCs did not have bloodline talents at all? Or that he was actually a player? It would be strange if the little female dragon didn't kill him with her claws. More importantly, these were his biggest secrets. The silver wizards of Buga liked to study freaks like him the most. He did not answer. Alaz had already moved the tip of her nose and sniffed him. She wrinkled her nose and whispered, "Sure enough." Sure enough? Brando suddenly felt a little strange. Because the little female dragon's whole body was about to climb onto the bed at this time, she buried her little head and sniffed along his collar, her curly hair rubbing his face, making him feel itchy. A girl's delicate fragrance lingered at the tip of his nose. The fragrance seemed to have a kind of magic, making him feel his blood begin to heat up. Soon he felt his whole body heat up. What are you doing? Stop right now. Brando had a headache. Of course he knew what was going on. He actually had a reaction. The other party looked just like a naughty loli, with no breasts and no butt, not to mention compared to his senior, even the half-fairy princess was slightly inferior. But at this time he actually felt his heartbeat and blood flow begin to accelerate. For a moment, he wondered if he was a pervert. Brando cursed in his heart and hurriedly moved to the side, because some parts of his body were obviously not under his control. Although covered by the blanket, there were obvious protrusions. He was afraid that the other party would notice this. Unexpectedly at this time, the little female dragon suddenly turned around and stared at him vigilantly, bared her teeth and asked, "Are you thinking of something bad, perverted human?" "No." Brendel stared straight ahead and answered with a resolute and decisive tone. What a joke. He did not dare to let this terrifying female dragon discover the truth. Who knows if she would spit fire at him, and Miss Merchant would be a widow for the rest of her life. Is there really nothing? The little female dragon snorted proudly. She suddenly flipped over and sat on him. Although she did not ride on that important part, it still made Brando's expression change. But the scarier thing was yet to come. She lowered her head and bit the tip of Brando's nose and said softly, "Brando, you are a perverted human." Brendel felt a chill run down his spine. The little female dragon's hot breath surrounded his sense of smell, with a kind of sweetness that made one's imagination run wild. Even the arrogant tone of this flat-chested lowly when she spoke became cute in his eyes. There was definitely something wrong here. Brando vaguely felt that this was some kind of conspiracy, but his body was still a normal man after all, and he reacted very honestly. The little female dragon looked at him contemptuously, and suddenly grabbed a key part of his back. Brando suddenly groaned. If one looked closely, it was not difficult to see the blue veins on his forehead. You're a demon. Brendel finally understood that the demon was here to toy with him. Human with a head full of dirty thoughts. The little female dragon said softly, "You still say no, you are clearly in heat. Heat your head." Brando was sweating. "What is that fragrance on your body?" He was almost gritting his teeth to ask this. He had already found out where the problem was. The highest level of hallucinogen, a dragon specialty, how about it? How about you? You better not play with fire. Before Brando could finish his sentence, he felt a heavy blow to his key part. If it was not for the fact that he could not move, he would have curled up like a shrimp. The cute little female dragon suddenly became a demoness in his eyes. "What do you want, perverted human?" Brando was sweating profusely. He really could not do anything. The little female dragon might look like a lowly, but when she pressed her hand on his chest, he couldn't even move a finger. Isn't it exciting to have an affair in front of your fiancé? Brando wanted to cry but had no tears. He could only watch as the little female dragon smiled wickedly, revealing her cute 8 sets of teeth. As a dragon, her canine teeth were as sharp as a vampire's, but very small. But it was at this time, both of them heard a soft cough coming from outside the door. It was like a bolt from the blue. Brando turned his gaze, sweating profusely, and saw Her Royal Highness standing outside the door with a livid face. Behind her stood a female official with the same strange expression. "So annoying. As a princess, you still peep at people mating." Alaz complained loudly, then lightly snorted and jumped out of bed. "So disappointing. I'll leave it to you, Brando." After saying that, he waved his hand and disappeared from the room. But Brando heard a different version of this sentence. "This is your punishment for giving my golden apple to others without permission. There will be no next time. There will be no next time." Brando felt that if he only did it once, he would lose 10 years of his life. He swore that he never wanted to see this little female dragon a third time in his life. He did not know why this girl found trouble with him. It was all a bloody case caused by an earring. Brando wanted to cry but had no tears. Then he heard another cold voice. "Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Brando. Remember to close the door next time." Her Royal Highness turned and left. P.S. Only one chapter today, sob, but it's 5,800 words. I specially approve you to count it as 2 chapters. Recommend a god game, a card-type web game, AC Fun's King Summon. I think there should be a lot of people who know about this. The quality of the game is not bad. The website is http://wz. AC Fun. TV. I played for a long time today. No, last night. == To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 655. As soon as the little female dragon left, Brando finally regained his freedom. He hurriedly created a water ball and threw it on his face. The cold temperature finally calmed his accelerated blood flow a little. Only then did he put on a coat and rushed out. As soon as he went out, he saw Amandina in the courtyard. Amandina was sitting on a stone chair reading a geography book, but her mind was obviously not on the book. The princess seems to be very angry. Amandina greeted Brando as he walked out, put down the book and asked worriedly. "It's nothing." Brando sighed. "Where's Alaz?" My lord, are you talking about that dragon lady? I didn't see her. Did she leave? No, forget it. Brando turned around and was about to chase after her. Wait. Amandina stood up and grabbed him. When she saw her lord looking back with a puzzled expression, she carefully reminded him. Tidy up your clothes, my lord. With Brando's habits, he did not pay much attention to his appearance. He just put on a coat and ran out. Amandina looked at his disheveled appearance and blushed. She reached out and straightened his collar. Brando did not pay much attention in Tanajul. If it were not for his bearing, people would have doubted his noble identity. However, commoners would not be so knowledgeable. In fact, it was usually Falerne who helped him take care of his daily life. The careless merchant lady herself was muddle-headed, not to mention the responsibility of a lord's fiancée. It was because of this that the older of the two wild elf sisters was jokingly called Lord's head maid by the mercenaries. However, if Falerne was the head maid, then Amandina's role was more similar to that of a housekeeper. She helped Brando straighten the corner of his clothes, gently brushing the dust off the black velvet cloth, and said with slight annoyance, When will my lord be able to pay attention to his dignity? Brando never thought of dignity as something he was born with, and he did not care. It was not the first time Amandina helped him tidy up his clothes. To be honest, he could not see any difference after tidying up his clothes. He only felt that it was purely superfluous. However, he did not refuse. He only asked, How long have I been unconscious? We've been in Ampere-Seal for half a month, my lord. Amandina helped him button up his shirt, looked around and nodded with satisfaction. So long. Brando was shocked. He thought he had only been unconscious for 2 or 3 days. What happened after I fainted that day? Where are Duke Cypher and his minions? The Grand Duke is already dead. Huh. This news was completely unexpected. Brando never dreamed that one of the most important figures in the history of Erewhon would die. He paused for a moment before asking, Amandina, what happened after I fainted that day? What happened to the battle after that? Tell me in detail. Endless demons seemed to surge out from the darkness. It was as if he had been sucked into an endless nightmare that he could not wake up from. The torrential rain poured down, and the lightning flashed through the rain, forming a shining silver chain between heaven and earth. Princess Graphine's face paled. Mr. Stephen. Cough cough. I leave Her Highness to you. Mr. Leiter, I promise you in the name of a knight. No, Sir Leiter. I order you not to do this, I want to stay here. In that nightmare she screamed. But the serious old knight grabbed her by the shoulder and threw her out. She flew up lightly and passed over the demon's head. In the end, her vision was fixed on the kingdom's lion looking north in the rain. The snow-covered plateau and tundra was where the honor of the white lions lay. It was the battlefield where countless white lions slept, where the souls of generations of heroes slept. Perhaps every knight would eventually return to their homeland, but only the white lions would forever guard this land. This was a legend passed down from the old. They swore under the sword and followed the oath. The lion of the kingdom was covered with scars, but the rain quickly washed away the blood stains on it. Princess Graphine was already in tears. The Templar Knight Stephen grabbed her hand and led her to open a bloody path through the demon army. Why didn't you let me die there where my people are? She remembered shouting as if she had lost her mind, but Stephen turned around and looked at her. I am not Erewhon's man, Your Highness, but if everyone sleeps on this battlefield, then your kingdom will one day repeat this mistake. Please cherish your life. You are not living for yourself. Yes. Princess Graphine walked quickly out of the temple, and after a few steps she slowed down again. She suddenly stopped, stood on the marble steps that were as white as snow, and sighed faintly. Yes, why was she throwing a tantrum? She had even lost her usual calmness and self-restraint. Your Highness, please watch your step. The female officer who caught up from behind reminded her, panting. Timmy, let's wait here for the count to come out. Princess Graphine sighed and turned around to answer. What's wrong? The princess did not answer. The snow-white temple square reflected the light, and was slightly dazzling. She narrowed her beautiful eyes, and her pupils were like a silver line. The female officer quickly realized that Her Highness seemed to be in a daze. For the princess this was a rare thing. Graphine was indeed in a daze. Her gaze crossed the distant horizon, as if she had returned to the battlefield that day under the same blue sky. Swords and swords, iron and blood intertwined in a long and heavy poem. Perhaps dying on the battlefield at that time was a relief. However, those who survived had to bear an even heavier burden, and even inherit the grief from the dead. But the living had no right to choose. She pursed her lips. Too many people had died. The previous commander of the White Lion Legion, the Lion of the Kingdom, the Sword of the Highlanders Lighter, was dead. In the midst of a war caused by a civil war. Duke Cypher was also dead, the man she had hated so much. He was the operator of the first Titan, and he died at the hands of the merchant lady, without a corpse left. When she heard the news, she thought she would be happy, but even the feeling of excitement had disappeared. Marquis Balta, Marquis Yoakum, Count Vitokin, Greatsword Dwyer of the Erek family, and Chief Wizard Fleetwood of the kingdom. No matter what power they belonged to when they were alive, they were all Erewhon's people. There were even many students of the Royal Knight Academy, who did not even have the time to leave their names behind. No one knew what kind of story could be hidden behind a nameless corpse on the battlefield, and no one knew how sorrowful his relatives and friends were behind it. Only when Freya hugged Bessie's corpse and cried did she feel the cold stab of pain. It was enough. It was time for this civil war to end. But the nobles in the north were still restless. Without House Cypher's pacification, the situation in the future would become even more chaotic. Duke Erek's whereabouts were unknown, but he would not be captured without a fight. Count Ranner's attitude was ambiguous, and the other two archdukes might be waiting for the chaos to end before they could take a share of the pie. On the surface, it seemed like Erewhon was welcoming a new life after the war, but in reality, it was already at the edge of a cliff. Princess Grafine suddenly realized that perhaps the situation before was better. At least the kingdom would not be in danger of falling apart. She did not know how she had survived for the past half a month, and the Silver Elves were stationed in Ampere Seal. The illustrious name of the Dragon clan intimidated all the forces and forces, and they did not dare to move. Tulman's arrival made the situation in Ampere Seal clearer, but she understood that all these seemingly unrelated terms were linked together because of one person. The person who was crowned with the title of Miracle. She suddenly realized that the fate of Erewhon was in the hands of one person. But this person was neither her nor her brother. You're saying that Duke Cypher was killed by a Roman punch? Humph, he reaped what he sowed. Brando felt a burst of joy in his heart. Half of the responsibility for the destruction of Erewhon in the future would be placed on this guy's head. If he did it for his own power, it would be understandable. But he did not expect this guy to be a member of the cult. When Brando thought of the tragic fate of the future princess and the Valkyrie, it was because of the crazy plan of a cult. He was furious. But he quickly fell silent. What really worried him was Amandina's physical condition. In their previous conversation, he had carefully asked about Amandina's resurrection on the battlefield, but no one, including Amandina herself, could tell what was going on. He began to suspect that it was the credit of the demonic item obtained from the battlefield, but after Amandina took it out, he quickly ruled out this possibility. Although he could not figure out what it was, Brando could tell at a glance that it seemed to be sealed and could not have any effect at all. And Amandina herself also proved that she did not have the ability to heal herself. First of all, her blood was the red of a normal person, proving that she did not have a gold or silver bloodline. Secondly, her wound healing time was no different from a normal person's. But this situation made Brando feel uneasy. He did know of some special abilities that could produce the effect of resurrection, but those were not reassuring abilities. Some were even at the cost of sacrificing one's life. But Brando did not disclose this information to his own Amandina. It was also a white lie. He was determined to investigate it himself. Reaped what he sowed? Amandina heard Brando's words and raised her head. It means reaping what you sowed, Brando explained. Amandina glared at him fiercely. My lord, don't always invent strange words, you'll be laughed at. You know so much, but you always like to use slang. Only civilians would say that. I didn't invent it. Brando could not help but smile bitterly. It had been more than a year since he transmigrated into this world like a dream. But some spoken words were difficult to change. Especially idioms with a historical background, except for a small part that overlapped with the setting of the Nine Phoenix. Most of them would be regarded as the slang of country bumpkins. But this was something that could not be helped. People could quickly adapt to the environment in a short period of time, but they could not change deep-rooted habits. He lived in this world for a year, spent 17 years in the game, and lived in another world for 30 years. However, with the death of Duke Cypher, a historically famous family fell into a state of disintegration. Without the restraint of this powerful force in the north, the nobles became ambitious. No wonder Her Highness came to find him in such a hurry. He did not expect such a famous figure in history to die like this. There was also Marquis Joachim, Count Vitokin, and even Marquis Balta and Master Fleetwood died. Fleetwood died under the surprise attack of another demon king, but he saved a ship of people on the First Royal Fleet's flagship, Victory. And Locke, one of the 3 heroes of Erewhon, also died. Brando thought of the young man who smiled like Carglass and sighed in his heart. He was determined to protect them, the future of the kingdom. Benninger, that guy, actually sent the little prince back, Brando replied with gritted teeth. Does he think that he can be forgiven? No, in fact, he did not send Prince Haruz back. Amandina helped him fix the buttons on his sleeves, and finally took a step back, looking relieved. It's done, my lord. Thank you, Amandina. Brando asked. What is going on? I heard that it was sent back by a Medusa. I don't know the specifics, maybe you can ask Her Highness. Seeing that Brando was about to speak, Amandina quickly interrupted him. Well, don't let Her Highness wait too long, my lord. You are now the Count of the kingdom. What? Count? Then where is my fief? Brendel was slightly taken aback. This was completely out of his expectations. He did not care about it at first, but when he suddenly heard it, he blurted out. Count Tonagel, my lord. Isn't there still no change? Brando said. Then he was given a fierce stare. Brando had just walked out of the temple. The reconstruction of the Anderla Cathedral was actually only half completed. When he passed by many cloisters, he saw collapsed walls and a lot of scaffolding. These were all the masterpieces of the Shire. Of course, Brando would never admit it. Then he saw Her Highness waiting outside. Your Highness. Princess Grafine looked back and nodded in satisfaction when she saw his attire. How is the Count's health? He is fine. Your Highness. Before Brando could finish, Princess Grafine interrupted. Mr. Brando, the nobles in the north intend to support my brother on the throne. The Holy Cathedral of Fire also intends to facilitate peace talks between us and the north. What do you think of this matter? Brando was startled. Isn't this a good thing? But he immediately reacted. They have conditions, don't they? No, they have no conditions. They just want us to promise that the kingdom can maintain the status quo. Princess Grafine replied quietly. Brando was silent. Maintain the status quo of the kingdom? Which status quo? This half-dead status quo? This was unacceptable to both him and the princess. The nobles in the north still wanted to maintain the status quo of semi-independence since Ein 7. Brando only felt that these guys were daydreaming. He put away his previous joking attitude and asked coldly, what if we don't agree? Were they going to start a rebellion? Will the Holy Cathedral of Fire support these people? Princess Grafine shook her head. I'm afraid not, but even so it's unacceptable. The north is facing the threat of war. Lighter. The old Legion commander has handed the White Lion Legion to you. You should know, right? What? Brando almost jumped up. He handed the White Lion Legion to me? Will the others agree? He suddenly stopped talking. Marquis Balta was dead, and Lighter also died on the battlefield. If this was really the will of that lion, maybe the White Lion Legion would really fall into his hands. This was good news. But not exactly. P.S. First of all, thank you for your recommendation, Your Highness, but I happen to have something to do tomorrow. Woo woo woo, auspicious blessing, the house is safe. If I don't come back, QAQ. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 657. Even in today's Erewhon, the White Lion Legion was still considered a strong force. In the year of spring, Marquis Balta had used it to defeat the Lion Beastmen of Toquinen. However, it was only enough to satisfy the nobles. What he wanted was a lion with sharp claws and sharp teeth. He thought for a moment and replied, Your Highness, I'm afraid I'm not suitable for this position now. The princess turned back to look at him in surprise. Brando's furrowed brows slowly relaxed, and his expression slowly became firm. Why? She asked doubtfully. Well, Your Highness, do you want to hear the truth or a lie? Brando raised his head. There was a touch of breathtaking blue on the horizon of Ampere Seal, but it was just a sign before the next storm. The air was filled with the moist smell of the sea. He walked with the princess to the white square. The half-fairy princess was only a little taller than his shoulder. She was wearing a long silver dress, the thin silk clinging to her porcelain-like skin. The dress folded like a huge flower petal perfectly set off her slender figure. The truth, Mr. Brando. The princess' tone did not sound displeased. Well, to be honest, since the late king gave the sword to Krentelmare Balin, the White Lion Legion has been the sharpest sword in the kingdom for centuries. It's certainly a good thing for us to legally obtain the inheritance of this army. But Your Highness, you also understand that Sir Nevant Walloon Lyda, and the general of the left, may not accept a stranger as the new commander of the White Lion Legion, right? Brando was talking about the remaining two commanders of the White Lion Legion, Sharpclaw and Lion's Mane, and the commander of the White Lion Blade Knight Regiment. The only difference between the current White Lion Legion and King Eric's era was the absence of the Imperial Guard Legion. The Imperial Guard Legion had been replaced by the new Imperial Guard Legion after the Year of the Return of Glory. Later on, it became the predecessor of the Black Blade Legion. The White Lion Legion was left with Sharpclaw, Lion's Mane and Jude, as well as the White Lion Blade Knight Regiment. The Jude Guards Regiment was led by Marquis Balta. After Marquis Balta's death, the remaining three were actually qualified to succeed him as the Legion commander. The princess disagreed. This is the last wish of Leiter. Nicholas and Knight Stephen of the Holy Cathedral of Fire can both testify. They can't object. But is that the White Lion that Her Highness wants? What was the difference between a sharp sword that was only respectful on the surface and those fellows in the north who conspired against him? It's meaningless no matter who compromises with whom. What we want is a White Lion that is truly loyal to the ideals of the kingdom, Brando replied. The princess fell silent. Brando could read the uneasiness in the heart of this half-fairy princess at the moment. The quarreling nobles in the north could break the peace at any time and turn the situation in the north into a pot of porridge. But the key was how much time Erwin had, surrounded by strong enemies and under the threat of war. And the serious consequences of the war in Ampere Seal undoubtedly magnified this concern. If only he could fight for 2 or 3 more years of peace. No, just 2 years would be enough. In Brando's memory, there were still 5 years before the Second War of the Black Roses. There were still 17 years before the long night fell, and the days when wolves ran across the land. After that, Wond would never have a day of peace. But before that, there was still a war waiting for Erwin in the north. If he couldn't appease the nobles in the north as soon as possible, how would he deal with the Golden Mane Lion Mane Beastmen in Toquinen? Brando had a headache. Compromise was absolutely unacceptable. The history of the otherworld was still vivid in his mind. He really wanted to kill all these damn bastards with a sword. He couldn't help but sigh helplessly. So, Mr. Brando, do you have a better candidate in mind? The two walked to the side of the carriage, and the princess stopped and looked back at him. There is one, the daughter of the Earth Knight Everton. Freya? The princess' voice sounded slightly surprised. Yes, Freya, Your Highness. She is very suitable in terms of birth and background, and also participated in this war. She fought side by side with Marquis Balta, and won the favor of many people in the White Lion Legion. More importantly, the Lionheart Sword has acknowledged her. This seems to be the will of the late King Eric. Perhaps we should respect the choice of the Lionheart Sword. Brendel said slowly. Amandina had told him some of the information that Brendel had obtained from her. The princess listened silently and finally said, Mr. Brando, I don't want to hide it from you. Your thoughts coincide with someone I know, and she also recommended Freya to me to take over the position of Marquis Balta. Oh, Brando was a little curious. In fact, he already had a plan in mind for Freya to lead the White Lion Legion, because who else could be more suitable for this position than Leiter's student in history, the later commander of the White Lion Legion and Erwin's Valkyrie? But this reason obviously didn't convince the others. Freya was now just an unknown country girl from the countryside of Wuxia. Perhaps she was the daughter of the Earth Knight Everton. But this secret was not known by most people. Not to mention, in terms of talent, she was not the most outstanding one in this batch of Knight Academy. Then who would be the one to recommend this future Valkyrie? Maynard, the princess told him. You should have met her. She is the person I trust the most, and can be called my best friend. It was her. Brando's curiosity grew. The position of commander of the White Lion Legion had never been an inconspicuous position. So why did the female knight named Maynard take a fancy to Freya? After all, not everyone in this world had a pair of eyes like him that could see the future. For a moment, he couldn't help but think of his interaction with the female knight in the rain. That cold woman, whose name he had never heard of in history, had almost the same appearance as Amandina. But their personalities were completely different. He couldn't help but frown, and with a trace of suspicion he said, I don't know what Lady Maynard is thinking, but I really can't find anyone more suitable for this position than Freya, Your Highness. The core of the problem is still the Lionheart sword. The White Lion Legion also wants to find this sacred sword to realize the value of the White Lion Legion. In addition to the legacy of the Knight Lighter, their higher-ups probably won't have any objections. Besides, on the other hand, an unknown daughter of the Earth Knight Everton may be less of a threat to the three of them than I am. In any case, I am still a knight by Your Highness' side. The princess nodded gently, as if she had accepted this suggestion. And then? She asked softly. I plan to let Freya and Carlo lead the team, and let the Royal Knight Academy become a base for new blood for the White Lion Legion. The White Lion Legion also needs a group of outstanding young people to support its future, which coincides with the philosophy of the Royal Knight Academy. Besides, for those young people, isn't the White Lion Legion a better home than the Guards? Brando continued to answer. His purpose was actually very simple. What he wanted was a brand new White Lion Legion, so infiltration and transformation were inevitable. He didn't have anyone on hand, but the Royal Knight Academy was a good choice. The half-fairy princess frowned, as if she had heard Brando's implication. But will this really work? Won't it cause a backlash from the White Lion Legion? She asked softly in a pleasant voice. Of course it will. Brando was not afraid. But at least there was one advantage to boiling the frog in warm water, and that was it wouldn't aggravate the conflict in the beginning. Now, it was actually a compromise between both sides. The other side had no reason to completely reject them, but he and the princess couldn't completely control the White Lion Legion. Both sides probably didn't intend to force the other side into a dead end. At this time, if the other side thought that he and the princess were trying to control the future, the other side might only laugh at their naivety. But if they laughed at it, then so be it. Brando continued to explain. But if we can complete the unification of the South in a short time, then what can the White Lion Legion do, no matter how arrogant they are? The half-fairy princess sighed softly. Mr. Brando, what you said is very different from what I heard. But I don't know why, but I'm more inclined to trust your opinion. But can we complete the unification of the South in a short time? Brando saw the confusion in the half-fairy princess' silver eyes, not directed at him, but at the idea. He answered truthfully, if the nobles in the north don't cause trouble for us, we have a chance. He wasn't lying. The Highland Knight seemed to have a good impression of the princess because of his identity. Duke Vero and Duke Grinoires were obviously not keen on the struggle for power and profit. They were forces that could be won over. In fact, their enemies in the south were actually only Count Ranner and the missing Duke Erek, not to mention that Count Ranner himself had a deep hatred for Duke Vero. But in this way the problem was back to square one. Mr. Brando, do you think the nobles in the north will give us this opportunity? The princess asked again. It was not that she didn't understand, but all of this seemed to be a dead end. Would the nobles in the north give them this opportunity? The answer to this question sounded reasonable. Of course not. Those with bad intentions were eager to make a mess of the situation. But Brando pondered for a moment and gave a completely opposite answer. I think there will be a chance. The princess looked at him curiously. Brando thought of what Cruz and Tumen had said to him before. Maybe Wood would really give him a surprise. In any case, the key to breaking the situation in the north was the attitude of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The Holy Cathedral of Fire may not want Erwin to be caught in a scuffle. Your Highness, we just have to wait and see. This time, Cruz will give us a satisfactory answer. But I don't want to compromise with them. You know this, Mr. Brando. We won't compromise with anyone, Your Highness. Unlike Princess Grafine, Brando didn't actually have much tension and uneasiness in his heart. Because in his opinion, the most difficult times seemed like yesterday. The darkest period of history had passed, and the future would only get better and better. And he just needed to identify that goal and firmly go down it. The princess was slightly stunned, but she seemed to understand. She looked at Brando with splendor in her eyes. Brando nodded slightly to her. Some things were so simple, it was just that people were trapped in it and couldn't extricate themselves from it. Even when the princess was at her weakest, the Holy Cathedral of Fire didn't take advantage of her. Could it be that Cruz still wanted to make them bow their heads? The situation had actually been reversed. A faint smile appeared on Princess Grafine's face, and she sighed softly. She turned back and invited him with the unique, crisp voice of an elf. The weather is good today, Mr. Brando. Would you like to walk with me? I want to see the newly built port of Amperseal. Brando was stunned. He felt the beautiful silver eyes looking at him, and the affection contained in them was self-evident. But he was in a dilemma. On the one hand, it was the invitation of Her Highness, and on the other hand, it was an equally important arrangement for him. Before coming out, Brando checked the EXP he gained from this war. The harvest could be said to be very rich, especially in the final battle. Almost all of the EXP from the Titan that the Roman killed was credited to him. But the only problem was that the EXP had now turned into a dim gray. This only meant one thing. That was, the EXP had reached the upper limit of elemental activation. Next was a process that he was very familiar with, the elemental activation quest. In fact, the timing was just right. The war in Amperseal was like an important node for Brando. After the war, everything was on the right track. As long as the situation in the north was appeased, he would have time to complete this series of elemental activation quests. But there was only one problem. That was, now that his equipment was in a damaged state, he couldn't just wear a blank set of equipment to complete the quest, could he? However, repairing equipment, especially magical equipment, was a time-consuming and long job in the game. He had to prepare as soon as possible. Princess Grafine seemed to see his hesitation and asked, "Is there a problem?" "Well, I want to go to the workshop area first." Brando replied awkwardly. "I see." The princess seemed to understand. She thought for a moment. "Mr. Brando, do you know the most famous weapon and armor shop in Amperseal?" Lucretia's Weapon and Armor Shop. The name immediately came to Brando's mind. The most famous weapon and armor shop in Amperseal was neither opened by the dwarves, who were best at forging steel, nor by the elves who were good at magic arts. Instead, it was a shop opened by a fairy. This shop was very famous in the game, but it was not open to players. Instead, it was run by nobles. Only a few players with prominent identities and enough reputation could enter, but Brando, who dealt with skeletons all day, was obviously not one of them. He looked up, thinking that Her Royal Highness wouldn't want to go with him to the clanking and smoky workshop area, right? But he heard Princess Grafine reply in a pleasant voice, "Please get in the carriage, Mr. Brando. Timmy's, send the carriage to Lucretia's Weapon and Armor Shop." Before Brando could react, he saw the female officer in front of him personally open the carriage door for him. P.S. Writing is a little slow ==. Looks like I can't make up for yesterday's work today. I'll owe you for now. Anyway, today's work will be better. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 658. In Brando's memory, he had not been to the workshop area of Amperseal many times. What he remembered most was the rusty signboard that swayed slightly in the sea breeze on the side of the bridge at Grey Harbor, the messy interior of the house, the stove that had not been lit for a long time, and the old dwarf who reeked of alcohol. It was not that Red-Nose Odork's craftsmanship was amazing, but with a small barrel of strong liquor, the old dwarf would help you take care of your equipment, as long as he was not too drunk to get up. Amperseal was different. After the carriage passed by a fortress, the road became narrow and the houses were lined up. The salty sea breeze in his memory faded away, replaced by a heavy smell of smoke. The red signboard was made of brass, and the words on it were extraordinary, with the unique cultural atmosphere of a port city. The carriage passed by an old dwarf smoking tobacco at the door with a hammer in both hands, his beard strung with shining iron rings. They were either wind elves from Luzik or the forest further north in the misty Weave Forest, wearing a hollowed-out ring that covered the entire third knuckle to prove their identity as an enchanter. Most of these people were the best of the best from all walks of life, with a hint of arrogance in their eyes. They were also worth a lot. The workshop area of Ampere Seal represented expensive, luxurious, and the corresponding quality of service in most people's minds. It was like the aura of nobility that was branded in the bones of this port city. The history of the workshop area of Ampere Seal was even older than the port. It first originated from the trading market between the Erewhon people and the Southern Mountain people. Later, the market became the military station of Erewhon, and then developed into a deep-water anchorage, gradually growing to the size it was today. Today, there were still stone pillars covered with moss on both sides of the road in the workshop area, standing in the sea breeze, telling the history of the past. The carriage slid into a secluded alley, and the sound of wheels turning in the pottery or textile factories behind the alley became distant. Then the unique blackwood signboard of Lusitania came into view. The magic blackwood was suspended between a carved gold-plated bracket. There was no physical connection, but it was suspended in the air by magic and slowly rotated. Although magic was common in the world of Wond, the fact that a shop could use a permanent spell on its signboard showed the style of the shop. This wasn't even a shop related to magic items, but an ordinary weapon and armor shop. The carriage slowly stopped at the front door of Lusitania's weapon and armor shop. No one came out to greet them. Normal people wouldn't open a shop in such a secluded place. However, according to the princess's explanation, it was because the shop owner liked peace and quiet. Fairies were a strange race. Brando and Her Royal Highness entered the store. The interior of the store was decorated very elegantly. Many counters were made of dark wood that emitted a special fragrance. On each counter was a shiny weapon covered with glass, and a brass nameplate with the name of the weapon written on it. It ranged from the most common rapier to spears and armors. What surprised Brando was that almost all of the items on display in the store were magical equipment. They weren't the crude products of low-grade alchemists, but real magical items. There were even some ancient items. Brando recognized the horned axe. Caesarus the Cutter. This giant axe ignored 10% of the armor with every attack, and could only penetrate half of the armor at most. A divine weapon under elemental. This was a good thing. Originally, Brando wanted to buy it for the red-bearded Batum of the Red Bronze Dragon mercenary group. This was the only guy under him who used an axe, and he was also a rough man. However, when he saw the price, Brando immediately pretended that he had never thought about it. Caesarus the Cutter was priced at 550,000 tor. Brando immediately felt that the profiteers in the game were simply the model and conscience of a businessman. No wonder this shop only catered to nobles. Apart from those people who didn't treat money as money, who else would patronize this place with such a ridiculous price? He looked away and saw that Princess Graphine was also curiously looking at the furnishings in the store. However, her eyes were mostly on the display of various long swords. Brando followed her gaze and even saw a thorn of light. Princess Graphine, have you never been here before? He was slightly surprised and asked curiously. Princess Graphine put her index finger to her lips and whispered, "No, Mr. Brendel, I don't think so. This is my first time here. But I know the owner here. Aunt Tanya saw me when I was very young." Aunt Tanya. Brando thought that this was probably the name of the owner. It was a characteristic of the fairies. The fairies of Wond liked to give themselves a human name, but most of them were simple and lacked regularity. He looked around and found that there was no one in the big store. No, there was only one person. When the three of them passed through the center of the hall, they finally alerted the only employee in the store. To be exact, Brando saw a head popping out from a pile of boxes and realized that there was someone here. But it was a little girl with short brown hair. She looked at them curiously with her big eyes. "What are you doing here?" This question was full of meaning. Because generally speaking, thieves wouldn't patronize this place at this time, unless they were in a hurry to register in the prison of the city guards. On the other hand, they could only be customers or creditors. The little girl cleverly didn't reveal her relationship with the store. This way, even if the other party identified themselves as creditors, she could say that she was a temporary worker or something else. Brando's thoughts were in a mess, but the little girl's eyes were already wide open. "Ah, are you a customer?" When Brendel saw her, he hurriedly dropped what he was doing and rushed out, before he and the princess could shout no, or be careful. The little girl screamed and slammed into the open door of the cabinet, and then bounced back. With a clatter, the stacked weapons, armors, and cans suddenly fell to the ground. Brendel cursed in his heart. This shop doesn't seem to be as reliable as the rumors make it out to be. "I'm sorry to startle you too. This little girl is called Carol. Because her father owes me a debt and is temporarily unable to repay it, she is temporarily here to help me." Brando and Princess Griffine sat on the chairs, and the little fairy lady who was wearing a grayish-purple robe like a lone shark sat on the counter. She wore a pair of silver-rimmed glasses and looked a bit like a jewelry merchant in Paris. But she claimed to be the manager and investor of the Silver Cross Chamber of Commerce, and this weapon and armor shop was just a side business. The Silver Cross Chamber of Commerce was a chamber of commerce from the Neos Deepwater Port area. It was said that their background was a business organization under the name of a wizard craftsman from Buga. Therefore, Brando was very skeptical of her self-introduction. Fortunately, the Silver Wizards did not have any practical influence on the people of the land. Since they practiced isolationism, Brando was too lazy to ask. He glanced at Carol, who was holding her red forehead with tears in her eyes. "Isn't this the legendary child labor?" Brando expressed his sympathy. "This child is too young. Aunt Tanya, how can you have the heart to let her do those things?" Princess Griffine also complained. "Aunt Tanya, how much money does her father owe you? I will repay it on her behalf." "Hee hee." The fairy lady picked up her pocket-sized white porcelain teacup and took a sip. "The last time I saw you, you were still a little girl, Griffine. But her father owes me a total of 2 million tor. Are you sure you want to repay it on her behalf?" "Ah." Griffine was shocked. "Why is it so much?" 2 million tor was a huge number for most of the nobles in Erewhon, let alone ordinary people. Even for the royal family and those powerful Grand Dukes, this was not a small amount of money. Brando could not help but look at the little girl curiously. He wondered how her father was able to owe so much money. Unexpectedly, Tanya replied. "Her father was a good friend of mine when we went on adventures in the past. I promised to lend him money to open this shop. So in fact, the future owner of this shop will be Carol. I let her take care of these things because as the future owner, she should also learn all these things. Of course, she can also sell herself to repay the debt." "I see. Then what about Carol's father?" Griffine could not help but ask curiously. "Her father has already died in this war." "Ah." Her Royal Highness finally reacted. Brando also understood. In fact, it was clearly the responsibility of supporting a friend's daughter, but she insisted on saying it was a loan. This fairy lady's temper was really strange. "You are amazing, Aunt Tanya." Her Royal Highness praised from the bottom of her heart, but also a little sad. All of this is because the descendants of the Covardo family did not fulfill their responsibilities, and the war spread in the kingdom. This war in Amperseal has implicated many civilians. "That is not your fault, Griffine," Tanya replied. "The last time I saw you, you were still an ignorant little girl. But in the blink of an eye, you have become a competent princess. But I heard that you do not have a partner to your liking. So is this the knight beside you have your eyes on?" No. The princess blushed and hurriedly denied it. But then she explained. "Although Mr. Brando is indeed my knight, it is not like what you think, Aunt Tanya." The fairy lady smiled but did not say anything. Brando suspected that she was deliberately teasing them. Fairies have always liked to play pranks. In all kinds of legends they have a good reputation for fooling stupid people. And now this Aunt Tanya was obviously enjoying it. But she quickly became serious. "Oh." The fairy lady turned her head and looked at Brando curiously. "You are Brando?" Brendel suddenly felt a chill run down his spine, but he still nodded his head. Tanya asked curiously. "I heard that you saved Amperseal. Are you the hero of this port?" "That? I don't think so. Your grandfather owes me a holy sword." Presumably you did not know? Is that so? Brando was stunned. What? He shouted, wondering why he suddenly had a debtor. Looking at this pace, it can't be the legendary story of the son paying the father's debt, right? Don't tell me you don't know the weapon of the Earth Sword Saint. My grandfather's weapon. Brando was slightly startled, and suddenly remembered the sword of the Earth Sword Saint. It was a mythical weapon called Meteor. It was said to be a replica of the legendary blade that split the earth, the Fong of Sirius. The Fong of Sirius was the sword of the hero of the mountain people, Kula. The myth of the mountain people drifted away from the epics of the Cruise people, but Kula did exist in history, and he had an adventure with the Azure Knight. This piece of history was not widely spread, but the Fong of Sirius was quite famous. Legend has it that the mountains of Al-Kash were split open by this sword, forming a rift in the earth. The Fong of Sirius in the language of the mountain people was originally Syrian Lida, the sword that split the earth. In a sense, this sword was more famous than Kula himself. And the reason why the Earth Sword Saint Darius got his name was because of this. Brando couldn't help but look at Her Royal Highness. Unexpectedly, Princess Griffine nodded to him with an embarrassed face. Mr. Brando, I'm sorry, I almost forgot. Your grandfather's sword was given to him by Aunt Tanya when he was young. That guy also promised me that he would exchange a real holy sword for my sword in the future. But he didn't keep his word. Aunt Tanya complained like a child. But fortunately, his grandson is now a grown-up. Damn, it's really a story of the son paying the father's debt. Wait, what do you want to do? Brando shouted. He suddenly felt that the biggest mistake he made today was coming here. He originally wanted to repair his equipment, but he didn't expect to meet a debtor. There was definitely something wrong with this story. Don't worry, I won't really ask you to find a holy sword. That was a wish of mine when I was young. But now my adventurous thoughts have faded. The fairy replied generously. Even if you want me to find one, I don't have one. Brando replied in a bad mood. He did have a genuine Halran Gaia, which could barely be regarded as a holy sword, but it was a sword that he found with great difficulty. Asking him to use it to pay off his debt was simply unthinkable. He couldn't help but curse in his heart. For others, it was all kinds of good things to recognize a powerful relative. Why was it that when it was his turn, he either provoked an enemy or a creditor? What kind of detestable things did Sword Saint Darius do when he was alive? Regarding Brando's bad attitude, the fairy didn't care. Instead, she said to Carol, Carol, can you go to the house and help me take out that box? Huh. It's the one with a ring of gems on the lock. Oh. The little girl, who was still in tears, obediently ran to the back. However, no matter how you look at it, Brando looked like this profiteer-like fairy trying to find a way to get rid of the person in the way. Sure enough, she turned her head and said, Griffine, Mr. Brando, I want to ask you to do me a favor. Aunt Tanya, what's the matter? Before Brando could answer, Princess Griffine had already spoken. I want to ask you to help me find something. Aunt Tanya, those legendary holy swords have long disappeared in the current era. This is no longer the era of the War of the Holy Saints. Princess Griffine couldn't help but smile bitterly when she heard what she said. Obviously, she had some understanding of this aunt's eccentric temper. That's not necessarily true. The fairy looked disapproving. She put down her teacup. The real glorious era is just about to begin. But let's not talk about this first. I'm not asking you to help me find a holy sword or anything. Princess Griffine was slightly startled. Aunt Tanya, what are you looking for? This is actually the reason why I came to Ampere Seal. And I don't have to find that thing. I just want to take a look at it. This can be said to be my lifelong wish. Brando saw the disapproving look on the princess' face and knew that this old fairy must have had a lot of lifelong wishes. Maybe she said the same thing when she gave the sword to his grandfather. Aunt Tanya, so what exactly are you looking for? The Azure Lance. I heard that it's hidden somewhere near Ampere Seal. Isn't this even more ridiculous than looking for the holy sword? This was the only thought in Brando's mind at that time. P.S. Since it's Kyuso, then I'll just recommend the game Lucretia. Although it's just a doujinshi game, the quality is really high. I think I played it half a year ago. I suddenly remembered that I was about to write about a mysterious magic shop, so I decided to play it for a bit. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 659. The Azure Lance. Aunt Tanya. Where did you get this information? Brando saw that Princess Griffine was suddenly nervous, and her body was as taut as a bowstring. She asked carefully. It came from a guess. Tanya pushed the frame of her glasses up. I accidentally found something, and it inspired me. The princess breathed a sigh of relief and sat back down. I see. I see. The fairy was dissatisfied. Shouldn't you be asking what inspired me? No. I'm sorry, I was too surprised. Princess Griffine corrected herself, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. She didn't care at all. She only cared about whether the news of what happened under Ampere Seal that day had leaked out. But the fairy's temperament was just so eccentric, and she knew very well that if she didn't go along with her temper, there would be no end to it today. So she had to pretend to be very interested and asked, So Aunt Tanya, what exactly is it? Is it the documents that were lost before the era of the Lost Radiance? Of course not. Tanya was startled. The documents before the Tower of Babel collapsed are long gone. That's everything that countless wizards have been searching for their whole lives. How could I possibly find it? She put her finger to her lips and reminded them with a serious expression. You must not joke about this. Have you seen the anger of the silver folk? I understand, Aunt Tanya. So what exactly did you find? Princess Griffine asked helplessly. You'll understand in a moment. Brendel saw that the princess exchanged a look with him, telling him to wait for a moment. He could roughly understand the princess's mood at the moment, but contrary to what the princess expected, he was not in a hurry at all. On the contrary, he also wanted to know why the fairy was so sure. He had a vague feeling that this might be the original quest line about the Azure Lance in the game. At this time, Tanya clapped her hands. The little lowly had already moved the box out from the back of the hall. Brando originally thought that the so-called jewel-encrusted box was the size of a jewelry box, but then he found that he was wrong. It really was a box, and it was about 2/3 of Carol's height. The little lowly had to expend a tremendous amount of effort to pull it out. She was so tired that her face was red. Tanya stood up. Standing on the exhibition platform, she was only as tall as Brando's shoulder. She then spread her wings, which were as thin as a cicada's, and flew onto the box. Brando saw that the crystals inlaid on the box were actually defensive spells. The fairy lady placed her finger on the crystals, and the spells lit up one by one and then dispelled themselves. Only then did she fly up and pull the iron ring on the chest to open it. What is this? After the box was opened, the princess's eyes were attracted to the things inside. There were 3 black metal discs, 1 big and 2 small. However, Brando's eyes narrowed slightly. He almost immediately stood up from the chair, but he bit the tip of his tongue hard to calm himself down. The sharp pain immediately woke him up. This was the Great Earth Slate. It recorded the creation epic of the Cruise People, a sacred object in the original text of the Pale Poem. Legend has it that it recorded the text that analyzed all the secrets of the mortal world. In the future, it caused a bloody wizard war because of it. This was the root of the world's disputes, and now it had appeared in front of him again. Although the Great Earth Slate was called a slate, it was actually this kind of metal disc with a special texture. Among them, the lowest grade was black like black iron, and the higher grade was similar to gold and platinum. But no matter which type, the box was filled with the Great Earth Slate. He suddenly understood. No wonder this fairy lady of unknown age claimed that she had found something that could prove the whereabouts of the Azure Lance. Legend has it that the Great Earth Slate recorded all the secrets of the world, and if what she found happened to be the part related to the Azure Lance, then it did not seem difficult to come to this conclusion. I don't know what these things are. Tanya patted the metal discs in the box as if they were treasures, and at the same time looked up to explain to Princess Griffine. I and a group of adventurers unearthed them from some ruins in the north of the Gorse Plateau. I used other antiques to exchange for these things from their collection, because I think these things are very interesting. Very interesting? Princess Griffine asked with a frown. I don't know, but there is a language recorded on it. After I checked the literature, I found that it is very similar to a certain ancient language of the Cruise People. The fairy lady raised her right hand, and a gust of wind suddenly rose in the hall. Everyone thought that fairies were natural elementalists, and in fact they also had excellent talent in this field. Just like now, the wind from the ground rolled up a few pages of paper from a desk not far away, and sent them to Princess Griffine, and then slowly fell into her hands. Princess Griffine looked down and found that the paper was full of notes. Although she did not understand it, she could see that the information inside was all an elaboration and interpretation of some kind of language. She could not help but look up at Brando with a questioning look. "This is the ancient Caranjon language," Brando replied. "Huh." Tanya, who was opposite him, looked up at Brando as if she was looking at a rare treasure. "Darius was a fool, but I didn't expect his descendants to be so extraordinary. You are much smarter than your grandfather, little one." "It's not intelligence, it's just knowledge, my lady," Brando replied snappily. "More or less. In my opinion, knowledge is also a part of wisdom. The reason why most mortals are muddle-headed is because they can't see through their own destiny. Only those who have true wisdom can control their own destiny. Do you agree, little one?" Tanya raised her head and asked. She stood on the box and was not even as high as Brando's shoulder, but when she said these words she had her own momentum. Mortals could only see such an aura from the prideful adepts. Although adepts controlled the power of magic, they still held the power of wisdom in high regard. "Knowledge changes fate," that was the inscription on the silver tower. Brando more or less confirmed the identity of the other party. Her Royal Highness was still looking at the notes page by page. She did not fully understand it, but it did not prevent her from understanding the meaning of the above with her own intelligence and wisdom. She asked, "Does these words have anything to do with the Azure Lance? Could it be that this tribe of Cruz's people once safeguarded the Azure Lance?" "No," Brando shook his head. "The Caranjon clan has nothing to do with the Azure Lance, but the documents recorded in a similar language on these stone tablets are related to the Azure Lance." "These are not stone tablets," the fairy reminded from the side. She also used her hand to flick the metal discs. Clang clang. But Brando ignored her and said to himself, "This is the ancient epic of the Cruz people, the language of the Pale Poem." With a crash, all the manuscripts in the hands of Her Royal Highness slipped to the ground. Tanya's movements also froze there. In the vast land of Wonde, in the long river of history, the legend of the Pale Poem of the Cruz people had been passed down from mouth to mouth since an unknown time. No one had even seen the text of this magnificent epic. Legend has it that it was first recorded on a stone tablet, and later scattered in Tolad, the White Plains and Homan, and then only fragments of history were left. In the Dark Ages, the ancients gathered together the fragments of history and carried them through the wilderness. This was the first history of the civilization, and the history book after that was stored in the library of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but it was said that 1/3 of it had fallen into the hands of the silver wizards of Buga. But these were actually fakes that had been translated by the sages. The real Pale Poem had neither a beginning nor an end. It began at the beginning of the universe, and ended at the end of the world. It recorded all the secrets of the mortal world, and the iron, gold, and silver people could not understand more than 1/10,000th of it. "You said this is the original text of the Pale Poem?" The fairy jumped up from the box as if she had been pricked by a needle. But she immediately calmed down and looked at Brando suspiciously. "How do you know?" "Of course I know," Brando replied. "Stamptia Rosa, in the earliest times the runes contained magic. The earliest words were born from it, and today the witches still believe in the existence of magic in language. They call it the spirit of words. The ancient Caranjon language is only one of the original languages, and in fact the earliest documents have records of this. In the mortal world, the number of people who could say this was less than 10. Especially the runic text at the beginning, it was the real original runes. Brando was not a wizard, so there was no magic vibration when he read it, but Tanya understood it. She no longer had any doubts. Like a cat that had found a mouse, her eyes lit up, and she flew over to grab Brando's collar, shouting, "How do you know? Where did you read it from? Did you find the historical records before the era of the Lost Radiance?" Brendel almost choked to death on her words. He hurriedly pushed the fairy away. In fact, he knew that he might encounter such a result before he opened his mouth. Not to mention the fairy, even Tumen would jump up and down in anger if he was here. When he was Braggs, Tumen was already so excited that he could not control himself when he told him about the original runes, let alone the complete sentence. But he had his own reasons for doing so. He straightened his collar and gave the princess a reassuring look. The princess had been stunned for a long time. Although she did not understand the wizard world, she knew that Brando might have some amazing secrets. What's more, just the part about the pale poem was already shocking enough. She saw Brando nod to her, and she was relieved to pick up the manuscript on the ground. Brando turned his head. Aunt Tanya, of course I didn't find the historical records before the era of the Lost Radiance. You know that's impossible. But I just happened to have some research on the original runes. Some research, that's all. Tanya snorted softly. In the whole Silver Alliance, there are less than 10 people who are qualified to say that. You're telling me so much because you want to make a deal with me, right? This was the so-called shrewdness of wizards. Brando nodded. Aunt Tanya, I'd like to ask, did you find these stone slabs in the ruins of Hus on the Gorse Plateau? Ruins of Hus? No, there's no name there, but we found some antiquities about the War of the Holy Saints. There's a huge palace. Sure enough, it was the ruins of Hus. Brando understood. In that case, the stone slabs in Tanya's hand were the first batch of earth slabs to be excavated in history. But how could they be excavated so much earlier than recorded in history, or did it take a long time for them to be discovered after they were excavated? Brando leaned toward the latter possibility, but that was not important. He thought for a moment and asked, Aunt Tanya, do you really want to find the Azure Lance? Brando. The princess stood up. P.S. Relationship main story. I took a little more time to consider relationships when writing. Please forgive me. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 660. You already have a clue. Am I right? Am I right? Tanya flew up and looked down at the two of them. The fairy's face was full of excitement as she spun a few rounds in the sky. I should have thought of this earlier. Ever since the late King Eric built the city here, the nobles of Aween have held on to the secrets of this port for thousands of years. How could you not know about Ampere Seal's secrets? Griffine, why didn't you tell me in advance? Tanya turned her head sharply and almost dropped her glasses from the bridge of her nose. She hurriedly reached out to catch them. And Tanya sighed. Mr. Brando, you. The princess was really speechless. She actually didn't want to monopolize the Azure Lance, but the legend of the Holy Lance was too important. No one could imagine how much of a sensation the Holy Lance, which was as blue as the sky, would cause when it reappeared in this world. Whether it was the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the Holy Cathedral of the Wind Empress, or the Dwarfs and the Earth Holy Cathedral of the Golden Mane clan, it was impossible for them to give up fighting for this legendary holy object. When that time came, what would happen to the kingdom of Erewhon? Brando didn't think so. He shook his head. Your Royal Highness, there are no secrets in this world that can be kept. Aunt Tanya gave me an idea. Leave it to me. The princess looked at him, sighed, and nodded. Brando then looked up at the fairy in the sky and said, Aunt Tanya, you haven't answered my question yet. Of course I want to. This is my lifelong wish. The fairy flew to the booth next to Brando. She sat on the edge of the booth, one slender leg crossed over the other, her hands on her knees, and looked up at Brando. Speak, little guy from the Cataloso family. Son of the sword Saint Darius, what do you want from me? That's my grandfather. Brando replied snappily. More or less. I don't know your father. I can't say, hey, that's the son of so-and-so, right? It was very wrong, but Brando felt that if he tried to reason with a fairy, there would be something wrong with his brain. He just pretended not to hear this sentence as he turned back to take a page of the manuscript from the princess, and then turned back to ask, will the silver folk know about this deal? Why do you ask? Tanya was slightly startled. You know why, Aunt Tanya. Brendel had long suspected that this fairy lady was most likely the spokesperson of Buga in the mortal world. Besides, other than Buga's scholars, most people wouldn't study the ancient language. He reached out and tapped lightly on the paper. This is very important because this is the premise of our deal. Premise? I understand. Tanya pushed up her spectacles, her eyes flashing with inexplicable excitement. Of course I will know. Not only that, I plan to send it back to the Sacred Grand Library. The entire Silver Institute will be proud of me. Think about it, the Silver Alliance hasn't been this lively for at least 60 years. Hearing her say this, Griffin on the side wanted to interject several times, but she frowned and held it in. Brando sensed the princess' concern and decided to get to the point quickly. Otherwise, the half-elf girl would be worried that something would go wrong. He said, "But there's one thing. What if this spear has an owner beforehand?" "Of course it has an owner. Its owner is the legendary." "Wait." Tanya turned back and frowned. The eyes under her eyebrows were grayish-blue, like light sapphires. Could it be that the royal family of Erewhon has already gotten the azure spear? Or does it already have a new owner? Don't you know, Miss Tanya? Those sacred objects that have appeared in ancient legends as vast as the stars, when they reappear in this world, they all have their own missions. They each symbolize the beginning or the end of an era. So if the azure spear appears in Ampere Seal or Erewhon, it proves that it has chosen someone. Brando looked at the little fairy. He thought that she would definitely know about this legend. Of course Tanya knew, but she only just remembered. She stretched out her finger and tapped her small chin. "I see. So the azure spear wasn't discovered by the former royal family of Erewhon? In fact, it was discovered by Mr. Brando, Aunt Tanya, not long ago in the war." Princess Griffin replied. "Oh, I know that. Those annoying demons. I heard that they unearthed the Titan Colossus and didn't intend to return it to the Silver Institute." Tanya nodded. "But it turned out to be so recent." "That's easy. Just like you said, holy relics all have their own will. If the little guy from the Cardoloso family was the first to discover it, then its choice would be the people around you. If not, then it would mean that it had already foreseen that you would be meeting me today. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Brando certainly understood. What the fairy meant was that if the people around Brando couldn't make it recognize a master, then it had already foreseen that Tanya would bring it back to the Silver Alliance. He thought for a moment and felt that it was a good idea. If the Holy Spear didn't belong to Erewhon, then leaving it in this small kingdom would only bring disaster to Erewhon. But if it was handed over to the Silver Alliance, it would be different. Who would dare to have any ideas about the Buga mages? Besides, the Bugas would also owe Erewhon a favor because of this matter. This was undoubtedly a solution that satisfied both sides. Even the princess understood the hidden meaning, but she still had some doubts about the conversation between Brando and Tanya. Although it was said to be the legendary azure spear, it was still just a tool. Was it really that efficacious? But whether or not the Holy Spear stays in Erewhon, the Silver Institute will get the news through you, right? Brando asked again. Tanya thought for a moment and nodded. "Well, it's impossible for me not to report such an important matter." She glanced at Brando again and frowned. "How do you seem to know how we do things?" Brando smiled slightly. "Have you forgotten that I've also learned the primordial runes?" The fairy suddenly understood. How could mortals have the opportunity to come into contact with the knowledge of the Silver Institute? If Brando had learned from those mortal wizards, he would have learned some crude magic at most. So she took it for granted that Brando's knowledge inheritance came from Buga. She couldn't help but ask, "Little guy, who's your teacher?" "I'm a Highland Knight, have you forgotten?" "According to the rules, I can't say." Brando replied. "You're a Highland Knight?" Tanya had been completely fooled by Brando. Her small eyebrows straightened and then frowned. "Oh yes, that idiot Darius is also a Highland Knight. I almost forgot." "Forget it, let's skip this question." Brando laughed in his heart. The split between the Black Tower Wizards and the Silver Institute was a stain on the Silver Alliance. Although the timeline was very long ago, both sides had forgotten the old hatred and formed different inheritances. But as a rule, in order to not cause disputes, both sides would not talk about each other's history in depth. Tanya, who had accepted Buga's inheritance, was no exception. This allowed him to get away with it, so he continued. "So, Miss Tanya, you should admit that if the news of the Azure Spear's existence in Erewhon spreads further, what will happen?" Hearing this, Griffin also pricked up her pointed elven ears. Obviously, this was the part that Her Highness the Princess was most concerned about. Tanya put one of her legs down and stood up from the stand. She wrapped her arms around herself and rested her chin on her fingers, lost in thought. Obviously, she understood what Brando was going to say. Once the news of the Azure Spear's existence in Erewhon spread, it would definitely attract covetous eyes. Of course, if it were those petty thieves, she could easily deal with them. But the problem was far more than that. Whether it was the Holy Cathedral of Fire or the Holy Cathedral of Wind, it was unlikely that they would let go of this opportunity. She glanced at Brando and asked calmly, "If you can say that, you must have a card up your sleeve, right? This is the content of our deal." Brando had indeed premeditated since long ago, ever since he discovered the identity of this fairy lady. Otherwise he would not have said these things. "Tell me about it." "If it's the first situation, the Azure Spear will be sent to Buga. Naturally there won't be a problem. But you have to declare that the Azure Spear is indeed in your hands, and can't cause trouble for Erwin. Is that okay?" Brando asked. He glanced at the princess, and the half-elf girl nodded at him to show her support. "Course not, that's fair." Tanya thought for a moment. "And as an elder, it's not worthwhile for me to take advantage of you. I'll even compensate you." Brando smiled and did not refute. "Then what about the second situation? How about I rent the Azure Spear to you?" "Ah." He immediately heard Her Highness the Princess cry out softly, and Tanya's eyes lit up at once. "You're so cunning." The fairy lady could not help but exclaim, and then said to the half-elf girl, "Griffine, where did you find this guy? In my opinion, you'd better tie him up quickly." "Aunt Tanya." Princess Griffine was a little helpless, but also a little curious. "What exactly is it that deserves such praise from you?" "I'm not praising him," Tanya replied snappily. "The Silver Society's interest in the Azure Spear is limited to research. You know, the Silver people's interest in ordinary things has gradually faded in their long lives. Only those ancient secrets can attract our attention. So we won't take possession of this spear at all. That guy knows this, and that's why he rented it to us. It's said to be a loan, but he's letting Erwin of Buga take the blame. And speaking of the loan," Tanya suddenly stared at Brando. "You're not going to charge us rent, are you? Isn't this a matter of course?" Brando asked. "And this is just one of the deals. Before that, we agreed to take you to the Azure Spear. Aunt Tanya, shouldn't you pay for it again?" He replied. The fairy lady felt that she had met the most black-hearted businessman in history. Of course, she did not know that this kind of businessman was called a player. She glared at Brando but heard Princess Griffine laugh. "Brando has a point, doesn't he, Aunt Tanya?" "Of course you think he has a point." The fairy lady snorted. "But it doesn't matter. Overall, I'm the one who has the advantage. Tell me, what do you want? If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 661. Tell me, what do you want? As soon as the fairy opened her mouth, Brando showed a satisfied smile, because at least at this point, he knew that his goal was already half complete. "First, we need an environment that will allow us to complete the deal." Brando replied. What's that?" Tanya asked warily, staring at Brando suspiciously. "Little guy from the Cataloso family, you're saying more and more new words, but I always feel like you're up to no good." Of course he was up to no good. But how could Brando say that out loud? He shrugged. "That's not it, but Aunt Tanya, you also know that after the war, Ampere-Seal is a mixed bag of good and bad people, especially the spies of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the northern nobles, who are closely watching our every move in the city. Among them, those northern nobles, you know what kind of forces are behind them." The fairy quickly flew up. Brando's words just happened to point out one of her worries. She circled in the sky a little irritably and muttered, "The Holy Cathedral of Fire and the cultists are indeed troublesome. Especially the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Although they don't have much power, they're annoying like flies buzzing around." Brando blushed with shame. In his opinion, only the silver folk would dare to say that the Holy Cathedral of Fire was like a fly. But in terms of their hatred for this force, the two of them were the same and reached a consensus. "Of course, we'll completely clean them out, so that they have no reason to establish themselves in Ampere-Seal." Before Brando could finish, he was interrupted by Tanya. "Wait, you don't want us to help you regain control of Ampere-Seal, do you?" As everyone knew, Ampere-Seal was an autonomous port promised to the Holy Cathedral by the Erwin royal family. Today, with the rise of religious power, the Holy Cathedral more or less occupied such land in the various kingdoms under his rule. In fact, the nobles of Erwin had been coveting Ampere-Seal for a long time. But no one was as bold as Brando. Brando looked back at Princess Griffine, only to see her mouth slightly open, looking at him in surprise as if she was seeing him for the first time. But this was nothing, Brando thought. This was just the beginning. What he wanted was a brand new Erwin. A Erwin who would not be manipulated by anyone, and could control his own destiny. He already had a plan in mind, and his tone became confident. If that's not the case, do you think the Azure Lance can easily leave Erwin's territory? Although the Holy Cathedral of Fire does not dare to snatch things from the hands of the Bugas, they can still insist that the Azure Lance was unearthed from Erwin. As you know, Erwin is also within the traditional sphere of influence of the Cruz people. He was not lying because Erwin was also a descendant of the Flame King, and the relationship between Erwin and the Holy Cathedral of Fire was well known. Even the people of Erwin believed that they should be under the jurisdiction of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Except for Brando, of course. The fairy frowned. Little guy from Cardeloso, aren't you too naive to think that way? Do you think that the Silver Alliance can single-handedly put pressure on the Holy Cathedral of Fire to make those greedy fanatics give up this port? Brando was a little agitated. This was something he had thought about for a long time, so he had a way to deal with it. He had never felt that the opportunity was so close to Erwin for a moment. If it was in the past, of course not. But now the Holy Cathedral of Fire has made a huge mistake. They have led the demons into this world. Have you forgotten the Sacred Covenant? Now that the Silver Elves and the Bugas mages are all here, what if you all ask them to give up the jurisdiction of this port according to the provisions of the Sacred Covenant? You have the right, don't you? Brando asked, smiling like a fox. The sound of Her Royal Highness inhaling softly came from behind. Tanya also inhaled. You planned this a long time ago, didn't you? The fairy suddenly realized that things might be as Brando expected. If this was the case, the Holy Cathedral of Fire might really have to give up Ampere Seal. Especially when the Sacred War was imminent on the ground. This little guy was changing history. She suddenly realized this and couldn't help but take a deep look at Brando. But Brando disagreed and replied, "This is just to ensure the completion of the transaction. If the Bugas have the ability, why not do it better?" Even Aunt Tanya should admit that in order to ensure the safety of the transaction, we have to sort out a quiet environment, right? Besides, no matter what, the Silver Mages will be able to get the Azure Lance. This transaction is a profit for you all. That's right, little fox. The fairy snorted. But she didn't care whether Erwin could take back Ampere Seal, she just thought it was troublesome. In fact, she knew very well that for the sake of the Azure Lance, the archivists in the Sacred Library would do anything. Not to mention helping Erwin take back a port, even if they had to join the Sacred War of the Mortals, so what? The long life of the Silver Folk had already shaped their arrogant and indifferent character. Good. Brando nodded with satisfaction. Sweeping the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the northern nobles out of Ampere Seal so that Erwin could take back the port was actually only part of the deal. The key was that in this way, the tentacles of the Holy Cathedral and the northern nobles would have a hard time penetrating the center of the south, and it would be much easier for Her Royal Highness to complete the unification of the southern territory. Of course, he wouldn't say these hidden parts and take up the share of the transaction. He continued. Then the next thing is the compensation I need personally. What do you need now? Tanya asked in annoyance. What I want is very simple. I want to learn how to decipher ancient characters from you, and study these 3 slates with you while you stay at the port. Brando replied. In fact, for him this was the crux of the deal. No one knew what kind of bloodshed these earth slates would cause in the future, because the knowledge on the slates was too precious. It not only recorded ancient history, but also secret methods and knowledge from before the glory was lost. About the past and everything about the people of the gods who had disappeared. But deciphering the slates was a specialized skill, and even the mages of Galbu knew very little about it, and now was an opportunity to get started. How could Brando let it go? Erwin missed the first war of the Holy Saints, so he couldn't become one of the most powerful empires in the world of Wond. But now, with him around, how could Erwin miss another opportunity? However, this deal sounded a little insignificant to Tanya. She froze for a moment, probably not expecting Brando's request to be so simple. The fairy's face softened a little, and she looked at Brando carefully. So you're not really greedy. It's been hard on you. She flew to Griffine's side and sighed. You have a great night, Graphene. Yes. The half-fairy princess nodded seriously. Brando blushed with shame. Obviously, these two ladies thought he had to ask for an exorbitant price for the future of the kingdom. But in fact, this was really putting the cart before the horse. Well, I'll fulfill your request. The search for knowledge is a noble thing, and this is not part of the deal. What else do you want? Tell me, little guy. Tanya suddenly spoke. Well, how about helping me repair my equipment? Speaking of which, this was actually his original purpose for coming here today. But after thinking for a moment, he added, can you help me find some magic equipment while you're at it? This shouldn't be difficult for a Buga wizard, right? That's hard to say. The inferior magic equipment has been dismantled by those old guys, and I can't find any better ones for you. Tanya replied casually. Let's take a look at the equipment you want to repair first. Speaking of which, this is your purpose for coming here. Brando nodded, and then took out the equipment from the dimensional cave one by one. The fairy looked at it and suddenly exclaimed, Firefly, how did it become so broken? Wait, isn't this the Crimson Blessing? Did you throw it into the magic furnace to be recast? Martha above, the dragon god will definitely curse you. Every time Brando took out a piece of fantasy magic equipment, Tanya's eyes widened a little. In the end, she had to hold her glasses and stared at Brando, somewhat stunned. Did you rob a dragon's treasury? How can there be so many fantasy items? Also, is the equipment you want to help me find all like this? Do you think I look like a big fat sheep? She couldn't help but scream. No, you're mistaken. Brando was sweating. In the era before the Great Demonic Wave, he did have a little more gold equipment. However, those were all obtained through life and death situations, not through robbing a dragon's treasure trove. He did have a dragon by his side, but he didn't have the guts to do so. I just want some talismans no matter what level they are. Talismans? Tanya was slightly startled. What do you want those things for? Not just talismans, Brando replied. Aunt Tanya, I need some talismans that can increase a person's physical and mental strength. Ah, the fairy reacted at once. Aren't these talismans needed by magic apprentices to practice spells? Kid from the Cardoloso family, aren't you the son of the Sword Saint? That's my grandfather. Brando explained patiently. And I also have the identity of an elementalist, but it's not for practicing magic. I'm not interested in becoming a wizard for the time being, but it's very important to me, Aunt Tanya. The fairy raised her eyebrows. I see. Do you want it now? No hurry, let's wait for things here to come to an end. Brando thought to himself that it was time to make some trouble for the Holy Cathedral of Fire. P.S. There were some problems with the network when I updated last night, so I posted it together today. 2 updates. In addition, this month's outbreak starts tomorrow, and this outbreak may last until the end of the month. Please prepare the tickets. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 662. Outside the window, green and dreamy vines hung down. The sunlight flooded the windowsill, and the room was quiet. The female knight, Nia, sat by the bed and peeled the oranges one by one into the crystal plate on the bedside table. Then she carefully looked at the delicate sleeping face on the bed. In her heart, the lady was probably the most beautiful person in the world. The words noble and kind seemed to be specially created for her. Few people outside knew what was happening inside Yenbao. Since the sword throne was broken, the struggle for power in the family had not stopped for a moment. The collateral branches all thought that the current head of the family, the current Earl Yenbao, should be responsible, but everyone knew that it was just an excuse. The source of the struggle was the Earl's younger brother, who was called Dear Baron Doll by the outside world. But it was not a full of praise, especially when Yenbao led the people to mention it. They all gnashed their teeth. About a month later, the Earl's youngest son was poisoned to death at the revival ceremony. It was later proven that he was just paying for someone else's life. The gluttonous little guy slipped into the kitchen, and his body was found with a little maid. There were some things that Nia did not dare to tell Dilfrey, but she felt that the clever lady could more or less guess something. If she had not watched the old master become more and more haggard day by day, the lady would not have rashly gone to the south. She stared at the pale face in a daze. The thick eyelashes drooped gently, and the lips were as red as cherries, dotting the snow-white skin. Over the past few days, Miss Dilfrey had only been awake for a limited time, but every time she asked if there was any news from the family. The female knight looked at her weak appearance, and several times she almost could not hold back her tears. The lady could not stand up and had lost the ability to use magic for the rest of her life. She was recognized as a genius in Yanbao when she was a child. What kind of power made her accept this so calmly? The female knight looked at her sword. The reason why she was called a knight was that her ancestors had been blessed by the Earl of Yanbao, but the lady might have her own choice. At this time there was a soft knock on the door. "Miss Nia." It was the maid's voice. The female knight seemed to be startled and replied with some shame, "Please keep your voice down and come in. The lady is still resting." The door was pushed open, and the maid's expression was somewhat ugly, but she still bowed and greeted first. "Miss Nia, there's someone outside who wants to see you." Nia didn't notice her expression. All her attention was on her young miss. She asked without turning her head, "Is it Her Highness or Miss Amandina?" "No, Lady Nia." Before the maid could finish, a voice rudely interrupted her. The voice was a mix of excitement and pride, and it was as high-pitched as a male duck quacking. "Haha, Ampere is not small at all. I wonder what the capital is like. What's wrong, little Nia? You can't even recognize me after a few days." "Akel." The female knight shuddered as if she had found this name from hell. A look of disgust appeared on her face. She stood up and subconsciously reached for her sword. However, just as she grabbed the hilt and guard of the sword, the man outside had already pushed the door open and walked in. To be exact, it was just a young man. His dark brown curly hair was very beautiful, but it contrasted with the pale skin underneath. His lips were so thin that they were almost inhuman. He had a pair of eyes that shone like black glass, with deep eye bags and wrinkles around them. It was obvious that he had been drinking too much. The youth had a mysterious smile on his face as he stood by the door. He was wearing a purple woolen coat with silver edges. His 2 hands were in a pouch, and there was a cane hanging from the crook of his arm. The tip of the cane was inlaid with a lion's eye. No matter how you looked at it, this young man could be described as handsome, but his footsteps were a little frivolous. However, when the female knight saw him, it was as if she had seen a demon. Even when she was fighting a demon, she had never shown such a look of fear mixed with disgust. When the young man saw the female knight, he smiled, revealing his white teeth. "Miss Nia, have you considered becoming my knight? I will give you the best warhorse in the north, but you are also the one I like the most." "In your dreams." The female knight was so angry that she trembled. "Get out of here right now." "Haha. Why are you so nervous?" The young man grabbed the maid's hair, and in the midst of the little girl's screams, he pulled her over and sniffed her face. He turned back and smiled. "Miss Nia, I'm here to see my dear sister. You don't seem to have the right to ask me to get out, do you? This is Miss Dilfrey's private room. You are crazy. Let go of her, she is the princess maid." The female knight's hand that was holding the hilt of her sword was slightly pale, but she did not dare to pull out the sword. The previous Count Yanbao had 4 sons. The 3rd son died young, and the youngest son became an apprentice of a wizard. There was no news of him until now. The eldest son was today's Count Yanbao, Dilfrey's father. Dilfrey went to Ampere this time with the title of Count, but she had not really inherited the territory. The 2nd son was the well-known Dear Dale, the father of the young man in front of her. As the saying goes, like father like son, daughter. The upright Count Yanbao had a daughter like Miss Dilfrey. In Nia's opinion, it was natural for Baron Dale to have a son like Akel. This father and son were the scum of scum. The young man let go of the maid, and the poor little girl let out a frightened scream and stumbled out. Akel laughed, and let out a series of laughter that was difficult to understand. "Miss Nia, don't think that I can't do anything to you just because you have the princess as your backer. You are my woman, and you can't escape this identity for the rest of your life." "Beast!" The female knight gritted her teeth and scolded. When she had just become a knight, she was ignorant and actually believed this person's flowery words. She would never forget that nightmarish night, when the demonic young man drugged and forcibly took over her body. At that time he was only 14, and she had just turned 18. When she thought of everything in the past, she trembled with anger. Akel, I'll count to 3 if you don't disappear from my sight. Don't blame me for being rude. She pulled out her long sword. Come on, don't do this, Miss Naya. If you wanted to kill me, you would have done it long ago. Akel said with a smile. Besides, I'm not here today to catch up with you. You know what my dear sister has done. I'm here today to stop you from continuing to shame the family. Nothing good comes out of a dog's mouth, Akel. What nonsense are you talking about? Naya frowned and pointed her sword at the demon's throat. She always felt that Akel was up to no good, although he might not even know what good intentions were. You really know how to pretend, Miss Naya. My dear sister has been accused of practicing demonic magic. The Holy Cathedral has officially begun to investigate this matter. Even the Earl knows about it. As her personal knight, you should know about it, right? How is this possible? Naya's mind went blank when she suddenly heard this news. Although she knew that it was impossible to hide the fact that Dilfrey temporarily controlled the Demon King on the battlefield, she at least still felt lucky. That was for the victory of the war, wasn't it? Her Royal Highness and the Earl can testify. The female knight shook her head hard, as if this was the only way to calm herself down. It's the Holy Cathedral that attracted the demons. How can they do this? Miss sacrificed herself to fight against the demons. Her Royal Highness won't ignore it. Haha, Her Royal Highness can't even protect herself. How can she have time to care about your lives? The young man sneered. He took a step forward and let the cold blade of the female knight touch his throat. He replied without changing his expression. Naya, I'm sincere to you. Believe me, only I can protect you and your young lady. Don't fight against me anymore. The female knight's expression changed. You actually have designs on Miss Dilfrey? She's your sister. She's my cousin. The young man corrected her, and at the same time replied coldly, Miss Naya, don't refuse a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit. Don't come any closer, demon. The female knight's whole body trembled. The young man snorted coldly. At this time the door was opened again, and a tall man shrouded in a gray cloak came in. The man was wearing a hood, and the shadow under the hood completely covered his face. It was like a dark void. When he spoke, his buzzing voice came from the void. It took some time to deal with that knight. After all, he's a gold rank expert. Be careful, my dear sister has brought 3 of the most powerful knight in the territory. Deal with that woman first. Be careful not to hurt her. The young man turned his head slightly and ordered, his voice cold and without a trace of emotion. Understood. The man replied with a buzzing voice. He turned his head to face the female knight. Naya suddenly gasped. She saw that there was no shadow under the hood at all. There was nothing. It was a blank space. What did you do to Ronan? She roared and slashed at the mysterious man with her sword. In her impression, other than her, Ronan, and Yvette, there were no other experts in Yenbao who had stepped into the gold rank. But the person in front of her gave her a cold and terrifying aura. It was not like the power of elemental power, but more like the cold aura of death. Or it should be said that there was no sense of life. It was like a void. Before she could slash with her sword, she suddenly felt a terrible shock explode in her spiritual world. Naya had never experienced such a terrible power in her life. It was as if a sharp awl had been nailed into her brain, causing her to scream and kneel on the ground with her hands covering her head. The female knight's shrill screams made the young man frown. He saw that Naya's beautiful face was completely distorted. Blood seeped out of her nostrils and eyes. It was a horrifying sight. Then the tall man walked over and slapped her on the back of the neck, causing the female knight to tilt her head and faint. Don't you know how to be gentle with women? The young man asked impatiently. There's no 3rd gold rank human in this house. I don't have to hold back. The man replied with a buzzing voice. All right. The young man waved his hand impatiently. Drag her out. I have something to talk to my dear sister alone. The tall man bowed respectfully before carrying the unconscious female knight out of the house. Akel looked back and smiled coldly. He closed the door and came to Dilfrey's bedside. Oh, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 663. My dear sister, How long are you going to pretend to be asleep? The young man tilted his head and stood beside his cousin's bed. He looked at her for a while before answering with a smile. His tone was so soft and sweet that it seemed as if honey could flow out of it, but the sarcasm in his tone was chilling. Dilfrey coughed softly, and a sickly blush appeared on her white cheeks. Her thick eyelashes slowly opened, revealing a pair of bright and clear eyes that stared at her brother. The weakness in the depths of her eyes was difficult to hide, but the flames of hatred were burning. What do you want, Akel? You heard what I said before. Don't you know what I want to do? The young man leaned down and looked into his sister's eyes. Hand over Yinbao's ring of folded swords, and I'll let you go today. What if I say no? Dilfrey looked away with some fear. The young man sneered, grabbed her chin and turned her face back. He looked at the face with some greed, the face that belonged to his sister. Do you think I don't dare to touch you, my dear sister? You're crazy. Dilfrey could see the fanatical possessiveness in her brother's eyes. She didn't know whether it was fear or anger that made her tremble. The girl's face was pale, and at this moment it was almost transparent like crystal jade. What a perfect masterpiece. That old uncle of mine could actually give birth to a daughter like you. The young man grinned, and one of his hands moved down and pressed on her chest. I'll count to 3. Tell me where Yinbao's ring of folded swords is, or don't blame me for being rude. 1, 2. The countess trembled slightly, but she stubbornly closed her eyes. She knew very well that her brother was not the kind of gentleman who kept his word. If she spoke here, then what awaited her would be a miserable end. If you dare to touch me, Akel, you can forget about getting that ring for the rest of your life. Dilfrey forced herself to calm down and replied coldly. Yinbao's ring of the folded sword was a keepsake passed down from generation to generation during the Cipher dynasty. This ring was to the Yinbao family what the Lionheart sword was to Erewhon, and the flaming blade was to the Cruz Empire. Without this ring, Count Yinbao would never be legitimate. Wrong answer 3. The young man sneered. My dear sister, you are mistaken about one thing. Do you think this ring is really important to me? The position of Count Yinbao will belong to me sooner or later. It doesn't matter to me whether I have those external items or not. In comparison, I'm more interested in you. As he spoke, he tore open the first copper button on Dilfrey's chest. Ah! Dilfrey felt a chill in front of her chest. Her snow-white skin was exposed. She couldn't help but scream. Akel, you're crazy. The countess finally felt fear. She struggled violently. But in return, the young man replied somewhat manically. Yes, I am crazy, my dear sister, but you asked for it. As he spoke, he pressed the weak Dilfrey back onto the bed. I'll give you one last chance, Dilfrey, the Yinbao family's ring. Akel roared. I won't give it to you even if I die, Akel. The countess wept weakly. Then you can go die. But as soon as the young man's voice fell, a cold voice replied. Yes, I also think that some beasts should die. Who? The sudden voice made Akel turn around in horror, but he only saw the door behind him fall apart like a piece of paper. A long black sword pierced out of it, and in the next moment, it was already in front of him. No. The handsome young man let out a shrill scream. Damn Anurek, where are you? Naya recovered after a short period of unconsciousness. She seemed to be slowly waking up from a long dream. She only remembered that she seemed to have had a nightmare, and in that nightmare there was a demon she didn't want to see. A conversation gradually became clear from this dream. Brando, after the matter in Ampere Seal, I want to go with you to Tanajil. Your Highness. What's wrong, am I not welcome? No, I just feel a little confused. Why would your Highness suddenly want to go to such a remote place? To be honest, if I could, I would rather stay in Ampere Seal. Because I have a best friend who was secretly abducted back to the territory by a lord. She is my best friend and she was injured because of me. I have to go and see her. The man's voice suddenly coughed awkwardly. 2 voices came from afar. The female knight was stunned for a moment before she realized that it was her highness and the count. So the count is already awake? She thought, then subconsciously got up and wanted to go out to greet them. She was a little confused as to why she suddenly fell asleep. But when she moved slightly, she found that her hands were tied behind her back. In fact, her whole body was tied behind her back to a pillar. Naya suddenly woke up. and everything that had happened before seemed to immediately return to her memory. "Miss Dilfrey." The female knight couldn't help but call out in a low voice. She suddenly opened her eyes and saw that the door in front of the hall had been pushed open by Brando and Her Highness. She immediately saw the maid beside them. And Brando saw the female knight tied behind her back at a glance. Of course he still remembered this cow knight. When he first met Dilfrey, he had even exchanged blows with her once. He remembered that the other party should be called Naya, Dilfrey's personal knight. But what's going on? His face immediately changed. What the hell is going on? Her Highness also turned around and questioned the maid. Before they entered the courtyard outside, they saw the maid standing outside with a pale face, but when they asked her what happened, she couldn't answer. He and Princess Griffine realized that something was wrong and hurried over. They didn't even knock on the door and directly opened it. They didn't expect to see such a scene as soon as they opened the door. Brando rushed to Naya's side, helped the female knight untie the ropes on her body, and then took off the cloth balls stuffed in her mouth. Naya felt that the foreign object in her mouth was gone, and before she could catch her breath, she immediately shouted to Brando. "Mr. Brando, quickly go and save Miss Dilfrey. Where is she? What happened?" Brando's face changed. After he and the princess left Lucretia's weapon and armor shop, they also came to visit the Countess on the spur of the moment. Her Highness mentioned that Dilfrey's condition wasn't too good. Forcefully using the devil armband had greatly overdrawn her life. Although she saved her life in the end, it was likely that she would have to spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. Brando originally wanted to comfort the Countess. In fact, he had already expected this outcome. The Devil King wasn't someone that could be controlled by just anyone. At that time, everyone thought that they were going to die, so they rashly let Dilfrey use this method. But they didn't expect that the one who was left with the greatest injury after the battle was this girl from Yenbao. But in Brando's view, this wasn't irreparable. At least the legendary Fountain of Life in the Black Forest could perfectly solve this problem. Of course, the Fountain of Life was just an illusory legend to the average person, but it wasn't necessarily so for him. Brando felt that as long as he waited a little longer, it wasn't impossible to enter the Black Forest to find the Fountain of Life. Of course, before that, he felt that he needed to calm Dilfrey down. But he didn't expect to encounter such a situation as soon as he arrived. In fact, before Nia spoke, Brando more or less guessed who the enemy was. There were only 3 forces that could cause trouble for the Countess now. The first was the Devil King, but the Devil King's revenge wouldn't come so quickly. Besides, even if the King of Chaos wanted revenge, he would first look for him and not the Countess. Then there was the Holy Cathedral of Fire. But using demonic spells could be a big or small matter, and the Holy Cathedral of Fire obviously wouldn't slap themselves in the face at this juncture. Besides, they wouldn't use such underhanded means. Kidnapping a noble? If word got out, the Holy Cathedral of Fire could close down in the future. Then the only thing left could only be a power struggle within the Yenbao family. In fact, as early as when he sneaked into the manor and first met Dilfrey, Brando realized that there might be a problem with Yenbao. Otherwise, they wouldn't have let a girl like Dilfrey come to such a place to represent Count Yenbao, and even bring along the strongest fighting force within Yenbao. But what he didn't expect was that the moment the War of Ampere Seal ended, those reckless nobles came to cause trouble for him. And they directly attacked Dilfrey. The anger in Brando's heart burned fiercely. Miss is in her room on the 2nd floor, and someone wants to harm her dash. Which room is her room? The female knight's words were interrupted by Brando before she could finish. The young lord's cold tone startled Nia slightly. She probably didn't understand why the other party was so angry. In her opinion, Brando was one of the culprits who caused Dilfrey to become like this. She didn't have a good impression of Brando, but now she had to answer weakly. "She's in the 3rd room from the left upstairs, Count. Please hurry up and help Miss." Before the female knight finished her weak words, Brando's Halrangaya was already out of its sheath, and the dark blade reflected a slight chill in her heart. She could feel the murderous intent emanating from the young lord. And in the next moment, Brando disappeared in front of her. Cruz's Flash Strike Sword Art. Brando was using Flash Strike Sword Art. He swung his sword backhandedly at a pillar on the 2nd floor suspended corridor, and cut it in half along with his sword. Then he passed through it and landed steadily on the corridor. The door to Dilfrey's room was already in front of him. But it was at this time that Brando's sharp hearing allowed him to hear the last conversation between Akel and Dilfari. It would have been better if he didn't hear it, but once he heard it, Brando almost went crazy. Is this still a human? Although he already knew some of the unbearable rumors about Erwin among the nobles, he couldn't believe that he could do such a thing to his sister as an elder brother. Whether it was the half of Brando's soul that was a modern person or the heart of a simple young man from Bucci, he absolutely couldn't accept it. His heart was cold, and he probably only felt this angry when he saw what Grodin did in Abi's castle. The element of space solidified with its owner's anger, and before Brando could even draw his sword, a white frost bloomed in all directions with him as the center. Brando swung his sword forward. The door suddenly fell apart, and then he saw the inexplicably shocked face. Although handsome, it was as ugly as a demon. P.S. Today's update is here. We'll continue tomorrow. Looking for votes? To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 664. Brando broke the door open with his sword, and the sturdy oak door was reduced to sawdust that fluttered in the air like butterflies. His black coat was like a rose that bloomed in the middle of a cracked wooden board. The petals extended forward, and a cold blade pierced out from the center, pointing directly at the noble young man on the bed who had one hand on the countess' neck. Akel probably never dreamed that someone would suddenly break in. His face was full of shock and he shouted angrily, "Damn you, Anurek, where are you?" The next moment, a black shadow pierced straight at him, but Brando had already guessed that there might be someone else in the room when he heard the young man's angry roar. He subconsciously pulled back the sword in his hand. Ding! There was a sharp sound that made one's teeth ache. Brando felt that the Haurangaya had blocked something. He squinted slightly, and only then did he see that it was a transparent longsword that shone like an ice crystal. "Get out of my way!" With a furious roar, the crystal sword pressed forward against the Haurangaya's blade, and it was about to cut Brando's wrist. But the Haurangaya was pushed forward, and a majestic force was released like a landslide or a tsunami. Instantly, the crystal sword that was as thin as ice was bounced away. Brando felt the gray shadow retreat, and then he saw that the person who held the sword was wearing a gray cloak that reached the floor. It was like a nightmare under the hood, and the black smoke was so dense that he couldn't see the person's face clearly. The ghost roared, and his muffled voice was filled with shock and anger. He probably never dreamed that this young human in front of him would have such terrifying strength. He didn't know that Brando was equipped with the Ghost Knight's crystal, and his strength was naturally one level higher than those of the same level. Moreover, it was a miracle that he reached the peak of gold at the age of 20. And Brando was the creator of this miracle, and he didn't intend to give the other party any chance. His long black coat was pulled back in the fluttering wood shards, and another ray of black light slashed at the strange person. Flash! Sword! The ghostly figure screamed strangely, as if it recognized Brando's swordsmanship. It had already been swept back to the bed by Brando's sword earlier, and now it had no choice but to raise its crystal sword to parry. However, when the two swords clashed, there was a heart-palpitating shattering sound, and countless patterns instantly spread out from the crystal. Brando did not say a word and continued to move forward with the Haurangaya in his hand. The next moment, the gleaming sword in the gray-robed man's hand suddenly shattered into countless pieces and exploded. The monster screamed as it realized that there was an insurmountable gap between it and the young man. At the last moment before the blade touched its body, it raised its head and sent out a spiritual wave that was almost visible to the naked eye, piercing straight into Brando's brain. Mental attack. The speed of the spiritual wave was extremely fast, and the distance between the two of them was extremely close, leaving no time or space for Brando to dodge. The moment Brando reacted, this mental attack had already pierced into his mind. Unfortunately, the ghostly figure had obviously targeted the wrong person this time. Brando's willpower attribute had reached a terrifying number after being strengthened by the blood of God. After the lightning core was implanted, it was even more heaven-defying. Thus, the willpower barrier created by it could even be immune to most spells, let alone spiritual attacks. When the ghostly figure's spiritual attack collided with Brando's willpower barrier, it was as if it had collided with a 1,000 mm thick steel plate. Brando felt that someone was spying on him in his willpower domain, and he could not help but sneer in his heart. He coldly watched as the spiritual wave seemed to have collided with an invisible wall and shattered into pieces. Then the resulting backlash swept back at 10 times the speed. Brando glared at the other party coldly. The ghostly figure suddenly let out a shrill scream. It held its head and shook it wildly. However, it was of no use. Everyone present heard a crisp crack sound, and then the monster's head exploded like a glass ball. Brando secretly cursed. He thought that he would see the legendary scene of the brain exploding and blood splattering all over the room. Of course it did not matter to him, but don't forget that there were a few ladies here. Who knows, maybe his name would spread throughout Ampere. But he did not expect to see the monster's head explode like a crystal ball in the next moment. Pieces of crystal flew in all directions like blades, piercing the whole room. Brando hurriedly activated the conflict halo, and the pieces of crystal collided with the magic shield and flew in all directions. In the end, he did not end up exploding into a hornet's nest. On the other hand, the young nobleman named Akel was not so lucky. He was watching the fight in the house with a shocked expression. Who would have thought that his subordinates would turn into a suicide attack? When countless crystal shards exploded, he was almost completely in front of Dilfrey, shielding her with his body. So the end result was obvious. The moment the crystal shards exploded, hundreds of steel needle-like shards pierced into his entire body, riddling his handsome face with holes. One of the shards even pierced his eyeball, causing his right eye to flow out of its socket like a lump of rotten meat. Akel, who was covered in blood, seemed to be stunned for a moment before he reacted. He immediately held his face in his hands and screamed miserably on the bed. That shrill scream was like an animal sent to the slaughterhouse, making people shudder. Dilfrey, who was pressed on the bed, did not know where the strength came from. She took the opportunity to push this guy away and struggled to jump off the bed. But she forgot that she could not walk at all. She fell off the edge of the bed and hit the floor hard. With a muffled thud, the Countess cried in pain. Brando's heart ached when he saw this. He hurriedly walked over and pulled Dilfrey behind him. The Countess' face was pale and she was trembling. She did not even realize that the buttons on her clothes were all open, revealing her naked body. She did not even have the strength to hold on to Brando's sleeves. If it were not for Brando supporting her, the girl would have collapsed to the floor at any time. "Are you okay, Mr. Brando?" Dilfrey seemed to have experienced a nightmare. The tears on her cheeks had not dried, but she could not say a word. "Don't be afraid. I'm here." Brando comforted her. He looked at the bloody man who was wailing on the bed. In fact, Akel had completely dyed the sheets red. Some strips of cloth stuck to his wounds and tore open new wounds, causing more blood to flow out from the wounds. Soon this guy lost his strength and screamed miserably. He trembled on the bed as if he was afraid of touching any small wound. His wailing gradually turned into painful whimpers. It was obvious that this guy was not going to live. However, Brando did not have the slightest sympathy in his heart, especially when he saw Dilfrey like this. He was so angry that if he could, he would go up and cast 2 more healing spells on the guy so that he could enjoy the taste of pain before he died. At this time, Princess Griffine rushed up to the 2nd floor. Her face changed when she saw the scene in the room. She then looked at Dilfrey and understood what had happened. "Beast." Her Royal Highness spat out this word coldly. "Who is he?" Brando asked. "I don't want to say this guy's name. He is worse than a beast. He is the only heir of Baron Dale. He is not Dilfrey's brother. You should know who this guy is." Princess Griffine looked coldly at the sobbing bloody man on the bed, then turned to look at Dilfrey with a gentle gaze and comforted her. "Dilfrey, are you okay?" The Countess was still strong in front of Brando, but when she saw her childhood playmate, she finally couldn't help but cry. Her Royal Highness hurriedly held her, comforted her gently, and threw a look at Brando. "How long are you going to hold her?" The meaning of that look was. Brando was slightly startled. "Let me take her to change her clothes. You made such a big scene here, the Coast Guards will be here soon. Do you want Dilfrey to be seen by outsiders like this?" Her Royal Highness whispered. Brando then realized and hurriedly helped the Countess, who was crying, into the princess' arms. Then he glanced at the young noble on the bed who was almost exhausted. Previously, he attacked out of anger and did not think so much, but now he realized that the scene was a bit difficult to clean up. However, this fellow reaped what he sowed. Otherwise, he would have left him alive and asked him what was going on first. Now, he killed a noble for no reason, and he didn't even know why the other party was here. But what really puzzled Brando was another thing. He couldn't help but take another look at the room. "What are you looking at?" Noticing his gaze, Her Royal Highness asked sharply. But Brando shook his head. He had some guesses in his heart, but he was not sure. He pointed to the bloody man on the bed and asked, "Nothing, what about this guy?" "Please leave it to me, Count, Your Royal Highness." A cold voice interrupted. Brando and Her Royal Highness turned around and found that Nia had come up. The female knight looked at the two of them with pleading eyes. Brando saw the pair of eyes full of hatred and anger, and couldn't help but be slightly startled. He hesitated for a moment but finally nodded. About 5 minutes later, a final wail came from Dilfri's room, and then the sound stopped abruptly. The actions of the Coast Guards were obviously much slower than Her Royal Highness expected. At least before they appeared, the Countess had finally changed her clothes. Brando saw Dilfri in a wheelchair with Princess Griffine. The Countess obviously hadn't been freed from the previous nightmare. Her two hands clutched the shawl tightly, as if she could get some comfort from it. But at least she could speak normally. The pale Countess looked up at Brando and whispered gratefully, "Mr. Brando, thank you." "It's nothing, so what's going on?" Brando asked. He didn't believe that the bastard came from Yenbao just to rape his sister. Besides, he also heard Akel ask Dilfri for something. He had a vague guess, but he didn't dare to confirm it yet. "You heard it too." The Countess blushed. She never dreamed that she would let Brando see such a shameful scene. It was a shame to the family. "My brother, he came to me for the ring of the sword protector." "That's not your brother, he's just a beast." Princess Griffine was still angry. The ring of the sword protector is an honor given by the royal family to the family of the sword protector. That guy wants to rely on such a shameless means to get it. It's outrageous. Brando nodded. He was not surprised. Erwin's nobles were only left with such nonsense. It was just that Dilfri's brother's means were too despicable. To use such means on a woman, especially his own sister, such a person was just wasting food in this world. "Why is Yenbao in such a mess?" he asked. This time, Princess Griffine answered for him. "It's normal. The sword protector is broken. Some of the demons and ghosts that usually hide will definitely take the opportunity to jump out and stir up trouble. If they don't do so, it'll be suspicious." The half-elf girl replied coldly, as if she was used to such things. She was indeed used to it. Not only that, she had experienced it herself once. In the face of supreme power, kinship was just a veil that could be easily torn. "No," Brando shook his head. "I mean, could it be that Count Yenbao, Miss Dilfri's father, has lost the ability to control the situation? If I remember correctly, Dilfri, you took away the 3 strongest swordsmen of Yenbao, but your father should still have a private army in his hands, right? If Count Yenbao still had a little bit of control over his territory and subordinates, that guy wouldn't be so arrogant." Brando did not finish some of his words, but the princess and Dilfri understood his subtext. If Count Yenbao still had power, Akel would not have dared to come to Ampere Seal and attack Dilfri so brazenly. Although Dilfri and Princess Griffine were only girls, both of them were born in noble families and were well aware of the rules of nobility. They immediately reacted, but Princess Griffine was the first to react. Her face changed and she asked anxiously, "Mr. Brando, are you saying that something might have happened to my father?" "You don't have to be so nervous, Dilfri. Those guys could also be foxes trying to intimidate others." Princess Griffine shook her head and comforted her. "The Holy Cathedral is making an issue out of you knowing demonic magic. I actually know about this. I originally thought that they wouldn't be able to cause any trouble, but I didn't expect that in a moment of carelessness, the Holy Cathedral is going to take responsibility for Dilfri's demonic magic." It was the first time Brando heard this news and he was furious. The demons were summoned by the Holy Cathedral, and he was the one who gave the demon armband to Dilfri. Dilfri was the daughter of a count, but she couldn't even walk on her own because she knew demon magic. She sacrificed herself to save the entire port. Now those bald donkeys from the Holy Cathedral were going to make trouble for her? Brando took a deep breath and frowned. It took him a lot of effort not to immediately turn around and make trouble for the Holy Cathedral. He believed that Princess Griffine was not the kind of person who would sacrifice others for the sake of the big picture. He looked at Princess Griffine. The half-fairy princess sighed. This was not Archbishop Wood's idea. It was just those clowns who colluded with the northern nobles. What's more, the cause of the matter was also the fault of the cruise people. I originally thought that this was just a little trick they came up with to disgust us, but I didn't expect that it was misunderstood by some people. This some people was obviously referring to Akel and Baron Dahl. But Brando frowned. Was that so? Dilfrey, he suddenly asked, are you familiar with your uncle? Well, I'm somewhat familiar with him. He doesn't have a very good reputation outside, but it is said that he is a very capable person. He has always been at odds with my father, but according to the family rules of Yenbao, except for the Earl himself, the lower branches are not allowed to have private armies, so the conflict between him and my father is just to the extent that they don't want to see each other. Dilfrey frowned and replied. She was obviously thinking about something. Then do you know what kind of retainers he had before? Brando asked. I don't know. Dilfrey shook her head. I haven't seen the person Akel brought with him. Naya may know something. She knows more about the flow of people in the territory than I do. I asked her. Brando replied. But this time he put on a serious look. I'll ask you one last question, Dilfrey. What? Has anything strange happened in the Yenbao area recently? Or has something like the Crystal Forest appeared? P.S. I have something to do today. I'll go out in a while. I'll continue tomorrow. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 665. This is a crystal cluster? Princess Griffine saw Brando turn the body of the man in the gray robe over, revealing a piece of amethyst-colored skin under the cut robe. She looked up silently and saw that the cut at the neck of the body was like broken glass. The whole body was crystallized, and not a trace of blood seeped out. This is a crystal cluster. Brando stayed by the body for a while before replying. Some living creatures in magic crystals are affected by the moon of magic and distorted to form a kind of monster. This kind of monster is not common, and occasionally found in magic crystal veins and crystal forests. But it looks like a humanoid creature. Princess Griffine looked at the body quietly. And what does this have to do with anything? Mr. Brando, do you know what happened to Yenbao? She stood outside the door, not wanting to be stained with the blood everywhere in the house. Although the beast's body had already been dragged out and disposed of, the Countess told the coast guards that a demon fleeing from the war in Ampere Seal had attacked her brother, and let the soldiers see the body of the man in the gray robe. When the people present saw Akel's tragic state, they could not help but feel sorry for him. Since such cases had happened in the port of Ampere Seal recently, no one suspected anything for a while. He was human when he was alive. Brando replied without turning his head. He picked up a piece of crystal shard. But it was the crystallization disease that turned him into this. Crystallization disease. Princess Griffine raised her head slightly and looked at him with her beautiful silver eyes. When I was learning the knowledge on the scroll, I saw such a case. Some creatures living in the crystal veins gradually went crazy, and crystals grew on their bodies. They became crazy and began to attack humans. Brando stared at the crystal shard, and the flowing light cast a narrow light spot on his face. This is the earliest case of the crystallization disease, and it happened in the wilderness of the Four Territories. This sounds like demonization. Her Royal Highness frowned and replied. This is demonization. Brando nodded, but then sighed. Because of the abundance of magic in crystal veins, it is easier to cause magic corrosion. However, the crystallization was very special. No one knew why the crystal clusters existed. In theory, every species in Wonde had a continuous existence, but the history of the crystal clusters was a blank. We have done some research on them, but we still don't know what kind of background they have. Her Royal Highness naturally thought that we was referring to the Black Tower Wizards, but in fact, Brando subconsciously used a player's pronoun. In the Amber Sword, the plot fans naturally investigated the crystal cluster, But as Brando said, all the investigation lasted until the Age of Light, and then came to an abrupt end. Some people thought that there was a huge secret hidden in the crystal cluster, but more senior players asserted that before the official release of the history before the Age of Light, the origin of the crystal cluster could only be a mystery. However, it wasn't easy to track down the history of the Age of Light. The main source of information for the players was Buga's library, but the history of the Age of Light was beyond the reach of Buga's wizards. Where did the crystal clusters come from? Brando didn't care about this, he only cared about why they suddenly appeared in Erewhon. There were no relevant records in history at all. The history of the North seemed to be changing, and it seemed to have begun to deviate from the trajectory he knew. After listening to Brando's answer, Princess Griffine was silent for a while. But after a while she asked again. But Dilfrey also said that there is no crystal forest near Yenbao. So that's what I'm puzzled about, Brando replied. Princess Griffine frowned uneasily. She looked at Brando and asked, "Why do you say that?" "Because I found similar traces on Akel's body. Some crystals grew on the back of his neck, but no one noticed it under the bloodstains." Brando turned back and looked at her. He replied with certainty, "This can also explain why this guy suddenly became so crazy. The dark magic will release the evil in his heart. This is not an isolated case. There must be a crystal disease spreading near Yenbao, and Baron Dahl may have been corrupted." The princess frowned deeper. "How could this be? What do you think will happen to Yenbao? What should we do?" "It's definitely not a good thing, and there's no other way for the time being. We can only keep it a secret from Miss Dilfrey, at least until we solve the trouble in the north. Your Royal Highness, you also know the distance between Yenbao and Ampere-Seal. We can't and don't have the ability to intervene in everything in Yenbao." Brando did not choose to reveal all the uneasiness in his heart, because some things were just guesses to him. Besides, he could not explain his foresight of the future. He paused and just reminded, "Besides, your Royal Highness doesn't want anything to happen to Dilfrey, right?" Princess Griffine sighed faintly. "When I was a child, Dilfrey was my best friend. She didn't treat me like other people. I always treated her like my own sister. But when it came to it, I couldn't help her at all. If something happened to the Count, she would be heartbroken. I saw Count Yenbao once when I was a child. He was a good father. Dilfrey must have loved him very much." The half-elf girl's tone was a little weak. Brando knew that she was thinking of her father, Oberg VII, who loved his daughter very much. It could be said that Princess Griffine once had a happy family. But before he could think of any words to comfort the princess, the latter had already become determined. Princess Griffine took a breath and replied, "We have to quickly solve the chaos in the north, Mr. Brando." Brando was slightly stunned. He probably didn't expect the princess to recover so quickly. In fact, he was not good at politics, but fortunately this was a historical issue. He thought for a moment and said, "Your Royal Highness, the key to solving the chaos in the north is not us, but the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The Holy Cathedral of Fire wants to put pressure on us through the nobles in the north, but I think the people of Cruz obviously don't want to see a war. This is just another game between the two sides." Princess Griffine narrowed her eyes slightly. She looked particularly charming, but a cold light in her narrowed eyes showed that the princess understood something in her heart. Of course she understood this point, but what made her angry was that the Holy Cathedral of Fire was obviously playing with fire. The nobles in the north were not dogs raised by the people of Cruz. On the contrary, they were a pack of wolves. These short-sighted beasts could destroy the balance of power at any time for a little bit of benefit. The people of Cruz arrogantly thought that they could control everything, but in fact they could not control anyone. But she had to worry about this point. Endless compromise was impossible. Brando promised her that this time, there would not be any concessions to the nobles in the north. This was actually the princess' own idea. First, she would integrate the forces in the south that were close to the royal family of Covardo, and then use the power of thunder to make the whole north bow down. But what kind of price would she have to pay to get the Holy Cathedral to support her? Those hateful people of Cruz, they clearly needed stability in Erewhon, but they still wanted more benefits. Since the war in Ampere-Seal, she had been thinking of ways to limit the influence of the Holy Cathedral in Erewhon. This was actually one of Brando's ideas, but the Holy Cathedral of Fire was obviously aware of this. She did not want to give in on this. But Princess Griffine suddenly remembered something. She looked up at Brando and said, "Mr. Brando, can you wait for me here for a moment?" "What's wrong?" Brando was stunned. "Help me deal with things here," the princess replied. "I want Count Janalesu to investigate this matter. Yenbao is on the edge of his territory. He will definitely think of a way." This was a good idea. But Brando felt that the princess was hiding something, but before he could ask, the princess had already walked downstairs. Brando looked at the body at his feet, and helplessly checked the belongings of the man in the gray robe, including some scattered things, but did not find anything that could prove his identity. He straightened up and heard a familiar sound behind him. It should be the sound of Dilfri's wheelchair. He turned around and saw the maid pushing the countess at the door. "You sent those people away?" Brando put down the scattered things in his hands and looked at her sympathetically. He could not imagine how big of a blow this would be to the countess, but it would definitely leave a shadow in the future. Dilfri nodded. The coast guards were easy to send away. After all, everyone present was a noble, and there was also a princess of the kingdom. Her statement was conclusive and the evidence was there. Plus, the demons had been active in the port of Ampere-Seal recently, so no one raised any questions. After all, no one could say for sure if there was an existence similar to the crystal people among the demons. Anyway, it definitely would not be a human. I knew that Akel had a bad reputation, but I didn't expect him to be so crazy. Nia told me some things just now. It's all my fault for not protecting her well. Dilfri sighed guiltily. Brando more or less guessed something. When the female knight made the request, he actually guessed that there might be a conflict between them. However, this was someone else's family matter after all, so he could only nod awkwardly. "But Mr. Brando, I know very well what Akel and Baron Dahl are like. I am very worried about my father, although Her Royal Highness said so," Dilfri asked with some concern. Obviously, she was most concerned about this issue. Although Princess Griffine had comforted her with the attitude of the Holy Cathedral, the Countess was not stupid. She thought about it and felt that Brando's guess was more likely. Otherwise, her brother would not have appeared in Ampere-Seal. After all, Yenbao was still some distance away from this port. Judging from the time her brother set off, the war in Ampere-Seal should not have happened yet, let alone these rumors. Brando looked at her and sighed. "Dilfri dash. You're going to lie to me again, aren't you?" Dilfri stared at Brando and whispered, "Mr. Brando." "Aye." Brando was embarrassed. "What do you mean by I'm going to lie to you again?" But when he thought about it, he really couldn't be sure if he had lied before. After all, his own background was a big lie. Moreover, when he invaded this young lady's manor, it seemed unlikely that he would have told the truth. He thought about it and replied, "Dilfri, can I call you that? I actually have some analysis about your father's situation, but I don't know if you are willing to listen." "Of course," the Countess nodded gently, not knowing which question she was answering. "Just say it, Mr. Brando." "It is very likely that something has happened to your father," Brando replied. Dilfri let out a soft cry. Brando saw her grip the armrest of the wheelchair so tightly that her hands turned white from excessive force. "You want to return to the territory immediately?" Brando asked. "Of course," Dilfri sighed softly and replied. "Mr. Brando, let me ask your family. If your father is in danger, will you not be moved?" Brando shook his head. "Of course not, but I don't recommend you go back." "Why?" "It's very simple. Your father's current situation is that he is imprisoned, or he has already been killed." Brando saw that Dilfri's expression was getting worse and worse, so he hurriedly continued. "In the first case, once you return to the territory, your father will lose the value of his existence. And in the second case, do you think that you can avenge your father when you return to the territory in your current physical condition? It would just be an additional trophy for your uncle." After Brando finished speaking, he stared at the Countess, fearing that she would not be able to accept it and suddenly faint. However, Dilfri showed an unusual strength. After a while she replied, "If I die, can Mr. Brando avenge me?" "Of course." Brando shook his head again. "But what's the point? If you think that revenge can solve the problem, why don't you take revenge yourself?" "Take revenge myself?" Dilfri was slightly stunned then became excited. "Can I?" Can I take revenge myself in my current state? Mr. Brando, do you have any ideas? Brando nodded. Dilfrey, you are just overdrawing your life. Your current physical condition is not irreversible. Besides, the Count may not have been killed, but as long as you are alive, he will have a chance to be saved. The Countess was silent. Brando saw her take a light breath. I understand. Can you give me some time to think about it, Mr. Brando? Any time, Brando replied. But I also want to tell you, Countess, whether you agree or not, I will not let you go back to Yenbao alone. Please believe me, I am responsible for the heroes of Ampere Seal. Mr. Brando, you? Dilfrey did not know whether to laugh or cry. Thank you, Mr. Brando. You are too much. I have always been too much, Brando replied without blushing. It was at this time that he saw Princess Griffine coming back from outside. The princess seemed to have finished sending the message. She glanced at the two of them. Although she had heard their conversation, she did not express any opinions. Instead, she only said to Brando, Mr. Brando, can you accompany me to meet someone? Meet someone now? Her Royal Highness nodded. Brando was stunned. He vaguely guessed that the person the princess wanted him to meet might have something to do with the situation in the north. At the moment, only this matter could move the princess's mind. Only by solving the problem in the north, whether it was Yenbao or the future of the kingdom, everything could be solved. Who? He asked. Archbishop Wood. Author's note. Suddenly, Caven's block exploded. I feel like there's a million things to think about. After spending more than a day, I finally managed to sort out some ideas. I still don't know what will happen tomorrow. Caven's block is really like Antflow, having a few days every month. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 666. The maid Edessa looked out of the balcony worriedly. The sky was blue, but under the veil of clouds, there seemed to be some kind of uneasy haze in the increasingly heavy harbor. In her eyes, the red roof stretched into the distance, and the magnificent buildings depicted a unique landscape in Pasha Road district. That was the ostentatious, exquisite, and comfortable taste of nobility. But the traces left by the storm were still there, and the broken branches in the courtyard seemed to be a bad omen. I'll get someone to clean them up. The people down there are too much, Edessa sighed and said softly. But rather than saying it to herself, it was more like a question. She stared at the back of the man on the balcony. His dark brown hair flowed like a waterfall over his red cloak. The edges of the cloak were trimmed with snow-white fur, and it hung down to the ground. Edessa, there's no need for that. I won't notice anyway. You know that. You don't have to be so careful, the man said, his voice as gentle as flowing water. He raised his head and took a deep breath. Do you feel it? This is the smell after the storm. The air is the cleanest at this time, as if the world is brand new. But actually it's very dirty outside at this time of the year. There are branches broken by the wind, and tiles scraped off the roof, Edessa replied. For ordinary people, it's dangerous to go out at this time of the year. Hey Edessa, if you don't tell me, I won't know. You're always like this. Is the world so worthless in your eyes? The man could not help but laugh bitterly. Edessa saw him sigh and felt a little uneasy, but she still replied, My task is to tell you what I see, Your Highness. The man smiled and did not answer. She suddenly saw a flock of white pigeons flying in a certain direction. It should be the square of Newsock Street. The maidservant stared blankly at the birds as they spread their wings and soared into the sky, but it was not because she suddenly wanted to be free. She turned around and looked at her master. She asked worriedly, Your Highness, it has been many days. Don't worry, the man replied. Edessa could hear that he was not so sure, but she knew her master's temper very well, so she did not say anything. Instead, she buried the uneasiness in her heart well. This was something she was used to. The room was silent for a while, and Edessa quietly watched the pigeons fly away. She suddenly remembered a story she had heard from the elders when she was a child. It was said that when the birds in the north migrated south, they would pass through the storm and fight against their fate day after day in the heavy rain and lightning. But was it really possible? She could not help but look at the figure. Outside the carriage, the bustling shops and shops formed a unique scenery of the port. Although the aura of war seemed to have just faded a little, the merchants had already filled Ampere-Seal with prosperity and vitality. He opened the carriage door and carefully helped Amandina down from the carriage. This made Amandina a little embarrassed. As a servant, this should be her job, and not to let the lord. Next was the merchant girl. The Roman jumped from the carriage into Brando's arms. Then the merchant girl giggled, causing Brando to pinch her tender cheeks. Ah! The Roman's little eyebrows immediately raised. Brando raised his head and looked at the carriage on the other side of the square. The curtain of the carriage was slightly lifted, and the half-elf girl watched them from behind, then nodded slightly to him. Although the princess was eager to find a way to calm the chaos in the north as soon as possible, the meeting with Archbishop Wood was delayed until the next day. Ampere-Seal was currently full of forces from all sides. But in the end, it was still the princess who had the upper hand, followed by the Holy Cathedral and the nobles in the north. The Holy Cathedral was supposed to be strong, but after this well-known mistake, they had to temporarily hide under the table. As the person ultimately responsible for this incident, Wood was no longer the #1 person of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the port of Ampere-Seal. After he left the position of Archbishop, the Holy Cathedral had already decided on a new candidate. The new Archbishop Gladys was not well known in the Holy Cathedral, but Brando was very familiar with this neutral party. He was a good man, and in the future, this person served as the Archbishop in the Duchy of Antiburo. He had always called for the Holy Cathedral to maintain a fair and neutral attitude. The Holy Cathedral sending this person to Ampere-Seal also showed the change in the attitude of the Cruz people towards the north and south. The new Archbishop would not arrive at the port until at least the middle of the year, so Wood was still taking care of some of the daily affairs of the Archbishop. Yesterday, when the princess took him to meet Wood, the acting Archbishop, he did not expect the latter to go out of the city to appease the people of the parish. It was not until early the next morning that the Archbishop's invitation was sent to the two of them by the servants. This time, Brando brought Amandina, but the merchant lady also clamored to go. For some reason, mainly the young lady's performance in the last battle, coupled with a series of discussions on the ownership of the Titan's wreckage, and the key role of the Roman as the actual operator, the name of the young lady had long been known in the port, so it was not very shocking for Brando to bring her along. Of course, the most important thing was that Brando knew that he would never be able to defeat the shameless merchant lady. Princess Griffine, on the other hand, brought her brother along. The four carriages soon met in the central square, and at the princess's invitation, Brando and Amandina changed carriages. The three of them squeezed into the princess's carriage, which was painted with lily and crescent emblems. At first glance, Brando saw the young Prince Haruz sitting next to the princess. The historical Prince Haruz sat quietly next to his sister, just like Brando's impression of him a few years later. He was still a quiet and weak young man, or rather, a child. Both of his hands were cramped on his knees, his head was lowered, and the soft hair on his forehead almost fell to the collar on his chest. If it were not for the white shirt with the royal coat of arms and the lion-patterned sword, it would be hard to believe at first glance that this was the future king of Erewhon. Seeing her brother like this, Griffine could not help but sigh. In her opinion, Brando was bound to occupy an important position in the kingdom in the future. She originally wanted her brother to build a good relationship with the kingdom's important minister first. In fact, she even hoped that Brando could become Haruz's teacher. This was not a fantasy. With Brando's current strength, he was fully qualified to take on this position. If he still needed to be modest, then no one in Erewhon except for an old monster from the Renaissance era like Tumen could say that they were qualified to teach this prince. But Griffine also knew that with her brother's performance, it would be difficult for him to enter the eyes of this knight. After all, the status of teacher and student were complementary. In her opinion, Brando did not need a royal student to show his status, but he was not willing to teach a good-for-nothing student to discredit himself. Of course, some people might covet this position because they wanted to curry favor with the royal family. Griffine was used to such cases. Oberwe was willing to teach her swordsmanship back then, partly because the world knew that Oberg VII doted on his daughter. But unfortunately, not everyone was a wolf knight, and not everyone was Brando. Griffine thought of this and could only sigh faintly. But what she did not expect was that when she felt that things were a little hopeless, Brando, who was sitting quietly on the side, was very interested in the little prince. He sat next to Amandina, who did not speak for a while. Amandina was curiously opening the drawer on the side of the carriage to look for snacks. Obviously, it was not the first time she had ridden in Griffine's carriage. In short, no one in the carriage started a conversation for a while. Taking advantage of this short silence, Brando carefully looked at the future king of Erewhon sitting opposite him. To be honest, this was the first time he had seen the little prince in this life, and even in his previous life, he and the prince had only met a few times. Although he had been in contact with the upper circle of the kingdom during the last period of Erewhon's resurgence, he had never been familiar with the prince. Of course, nominally Haruz should have been the king of Erewhon at that time, but because of some well-known reasons, such as the obstruction of Grand Duke Erek, the future king was afraid that he would not have a day of independence, and in fact he himself lacked the ability. The Prince Haruz in Brando's memory was just like the present, introverted and timid, which was almost the most fatal weakness of the royal family, or even of the nobility. Cruz, the famous lord of the lowlands Hodland, had a famous line in the game. Nobles can be vicious, insidious, greedy and even incompetent, but they must never lack responsibility. And Prince Haruz happened to be such a person. His temperament was said to be closely related to the new Queen of Oberg VII. This was only a rumor, but the palace struggle had more or less made the prince timid. Although Princess Griffine was the favorite of the old king, Brando knew that in the royal family, it had always been Cypher, the queen's side, who had the upper hand. In history, Prince Haruz did not wake up until his sister, Princess Griffine, was murdered. But it was too late. Later, Madara invaded Erewhon for the third time, and Erewhon was destroyed. After that, Brando left this sad place. Later, there was a rumor that Iken Yura's daughter, Alara, reorganized the Erewhon rebellion. Some people said that Prince Haruz did not die in the fire when the capital fell, but was rescued by Buga the Cross, and later married Alara. But these were all rumors, and no one had seen it with their own eyes. Not to mention Brando, who was far away in Saint Tossel at that time. But history did not make Brando despise the prince. On the contrary, it only deepened his curiosity. He had read an article on the internet, by a Erewhon netizen who introduced the prince. It was said that although Prince Haruz was shy and introverted, he was actually very outstanding in many aspects, especially in learning magic and swordsmanship. The article even hinted that the prince might be a chosen one. Of course, this was just a one-sided story for Brando, but it did not prevent him from finding out the truth. As far as he knew, Prince Haruz had been learning swordsmanship under the guidance of Princess Griffine since he was a child, but it was said that it had not been effective, which also made the princess very desperate. So where did the argument in the article come from? Or was it just to attract attention? Brando looked at Prince Haruz's hands, which were as white and slender as a woman's. He could not help but shake his head. This was not a pair of hands that had been using swords all year round, let alone the hands of a person with outstanding swordsmanship. As everyone knew, any talent came from hard training. Even a genius swordsman like Buga was the fruit of countless hours of training. There was no such thing as a free lunch in this world. Of course, Brando knew that his case was an exception, but he did not think that Prince Haruz was a transmigrator like himself. But did the little prince in history hate swordsmanship? Or was he not good at swordsmanship? Which side was right? Brando sat in the carriage, but Haruz seemed to notice his gaze and retracted his hand in fear. What's wrong? The princess immediately realized her brother's abnormality, and asked with some displeasure. The education of the royal family required their descendants to maintain a minimum appearance under any circumstances, and Haruz's behavior today was obviously a bit too much. She knew that her brother had always been introverted and afraid of strangers, but such a helpless look was too much. In particular, she did not want Haruz to leave the impression in front of Brando that everyone could be bullied. Seeing his sister become serious, Haruz was startled and stammered, "No, nothing, sister. Your Highness, the little prince is only 10 years old this year, right? At this age it seems too early to learn magic." Brando suddenly narrowed his eyes and said, "The nobles often let their children follow some famous court wizards to learn magic and knowledge, such as the chief court wizard Fleetwood, who died in the Battle of Ampere Seal, to Princess Griffine, and Garlock to the king's eldest son's other sisters. But in fact, Alwyn's magic eventually involved the extraction of the power in the sea of magic. Although the purpose was to weave the law, the dark magic would more or less affect the spellcaster, so most wizards were physically weaker. For the same reason, although most wizard apprentices began to learn related knowledge at the age of 4 or 5, they generally began to learn magic when they were adults, or at least until the age of 13. But Brando found something interesting in Haruz. He was almost certain that this young prince had practiced black magic before. Author's note: I've written a chapter while I'm stuck, so I'm feeling better now, sob sob. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 667. When the carriage's wheels rolled over the gap between the stone slabs, the carriage vibrated slightly and made a continuous rutting sound. The carriage shook slightly, but it was quiet for a moment. Princess Grafine seemed to understand Brando's question. Her silver-gray eyes showed a trace of doubt. Magic? Mr. Brando, Haruz hasn't started to practice magic yet. I intend to let him mature before I consider it. Besides, Haruz is a member of the royal family. In fact, I don't intend to let him get too close to the wizards. This was a tradition in the world of Wond. Nobles often let their children practice magic, but there were few similar situations in the royal family. Magic was related to mysterious and unknown forces, and as the heir to the throne, it was necessary to stay away from unpredictable dangers as much as possible. Even in those great noble families, the eldest son was rarely born as a wizard. Even for Princess Grafine, Fleetwood was only her teacher in occultism, wizard etiquette, and history. Is that so? Brando stared at the magic triangle between Haruz's thumb and index finger. The sides of the magic triangle were smooth and almost transparent. This was a sign that there was at least one magic reaction, but it did not form a stable law like the first time he put on the Ring of the Wind. In Brando's memory, there was only one kind of spell that could cause such a change, and that was black magic. Is there a problem, Mr. Brando? Princess Grafine frowned and glanced at her brother. Haruz lowered his head in fear and put his hands between his knees. But Brando said flatly, No, I just feel that His Highness' hands are more like a wizard's than a swordsman's. Most nobles have already started to practice swordsmanship when they are his age, right? As he spoke, he saw His Highness Haruz look up at him in surprise. Brando saw that Princess Grafine was not paying attention, so he winked at the young prince. The latter quickly lowered his head, as if afraid of being noticed by his sister. The princess did not notice this, and she felt a little embarrassed. Haruz had indeed started practicing swordsmanship at a very early age. The problem was, how could she say that her brother was a good-for-nothing who lacked the courage to even hold a sword, let alone practice swordsmanship? Haruz because after leaving the capital, I haven't been able to spare much time to take care of him. In the end, she sighed and took all the responsibility on herself. Sister, Haruz said weakly. Shut up, Princess Grafine suddenly said sternly. You have your own reasons for this. You should reflect on it. Brando looked at the siblings and couldn't help but laugh. He thought that perhaps the princess had something to do with the little prince's cowardly side, because compared to the average sister, Princess Grafine was too strong. After being reprimanded by his sister, Haruz obediently lowered his head and stopped talking, like a shivering little animal curled up. But Brando asked even though he already knew the answer. There's also Lord Oberway and Lord Makarov, right? If I remember correctly, they are all famous swordsmen in the kingdom. He suddenly noticed that Roman was feeding a white cat with a biscuit. The white cat was sitting on her lap, and he did not even notice when it appeared. He only saw it with its head held high, and its golden eyes narrowed as it looked at him. Amandina noticed her lord's gaze, and she turned her head and curiously reached out to stroke the cat's head. Brando saw the cat squinting its eyes comfortably, and only then did he turn his head back. The princess obviously also noticed this scene, but she did not realize the purpose of Brando's question. Instead, she replied, They have all taught Haruz before, but Haruz's talent in swordsmanship. The half-elf girl showed a disappointed expression, but also a little helpless. Since a long time ago, the nobles had to lead their people into battle to defend against the invasion of monsters. The strength of the nobles themselves meant that they did not have the ability to protect those who relied on them. Although with the further expansion of the borders of civilization, the era of peace began to extend, and the symbolic meaning of the nobles' swordsmanship was far greater than its practical significance. But as the heir to the throne, if he was a useless person, it would more or less affect his prestige in the eyes of his subjects. Talent in swordsmanship is only one aspect of the problem. Normal people enter the golden age of learning at the age of 12, and it is not too early to say. But for a qualified swordsman, the first thing he must have is the courage to defeat himself. Brando looked at Haruz and said slowly. He didn't know if this prince was truly gifted or not, but he knew that for this prince, the crux of the problem probably wasn't his talent at all. It was courage. Princess Griffine looked at him in surprise. Of course, the princess understood the meaning behind Brando's words. "Mr. Brando, what do you mean?" She was already a little desperate. Oberway had taught Haruz swordsmanship for a period of time. Although the Wolf Knight was patient, he could not give Haruz the courage to face his sword. Brando nodded. This was also his original idea. In his vision, a kingdom like Erewhon's would eventually move toward a political system similar to the aristocratic parliament of Cruz around the Second Era. It seemed that the princess was also aware of this. But before that, Erewhon was the king who overachieved this change. At least he did not want to see a coward who was at the mercy of others. Moreover, if the players on the forums weren't mistaken, Haruz should have become an outstanding lord. "Your Highness, do you also want me to be Prince Haruz's teacher?" He thought for a moment and asked, "But I don't have much experience and I can't guarantee that I can teach His Highness anything." Brando was not modest, he was just giving a heads up. Before him, Oberway and Fleetwood were the teachers of the young prince. Brendel believed that he wasn't much better than the best of the best in this era except for his ability to foresee the future. In fact, he was far inferior to them. On the other hand, he really had little experience. However, he was more inclined to experiment with the little prince. The worst result would not bring any negative impact, but if it succeeded, the harvest would be too great. What's more, building a good relationship with the future king, whether it's with Haruz or Her Royal Highness, would gain a higher reputation. Brendel knew very well how much Her Royal Highness cared about her brother. Princess Griffine's idea was completely different from Brando's. The inheritance of Sword St. Darius alone was enough for Brando to become the prince's teacher. She knew that there was a huge network behind it, not to mention that Brando himself was also outstanding in swordsmanship and knowledgeable. She took a light breath and sure enough, her impression of Brendel had deepened. She managed to suppress the surprise in her heart and immediately said to her younger brother beside her, "Haruz, quickly greet your teacher." But Haruz raised his head and looked at Brando with some fear, then turned back and said, "Sister." He was obviously still worried that Brando had exposed his secret. Princess Griffine did not expect her brother's inner world at all. She frowned like a strict mother and said, "Haruz, Mr. Brando is the descendant of Sword St. Darius. Even Mr. Buga is not as good as him in swordsmanship, not to mention that Mr. Brando is so knowledgeable that even Master Fleetwood and Lord Garlock have praised him. As your teacher, what are you dissatisfied with?" Her tone became more and more severe, which startled Haruz. The little prince reluctantly lowered his head to Brando and whispered, "Teacher." His voice was weak and soft like a lamb, which made Brando not know whether to laugh or cry. He could clearly see that although the prince's attitude was respectful, but at this moment, not to mention himself, even a pig under the princess's coercion would obediently call her teacher. Fortunately, he was not in a hurry. Haruz was just a weak child after all. If he could not even deal with a child after 2 lifetimes, then he should go home and plant sweet potatoes. Not to mention that he still had something on the prince. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but smile and shake his head. Next, the two exchanged swords according to the etiquette of the world of Wond. Of course, this was just a ceremony. The process was that Haruz first took off his sword and handed it to Brando. Then Brando turned the sword around and gave it to the prince. In ancient times, this process symbolized the teacher giving knowledge and a sharp sword to the student. But now this ceremony had become a ceremonial form. After completing this formal ceremony, Brando had a teacher-student relationship to Prince Haruz. In fact, as a player, Brando had heard of the existence of this ceremony, but he did not know the details. Generally speaking, teachers would teach students for a certain period of observation, and the ceremony would be officially held only when they were satisfied. So of course, he did not know that Her Royal Highness was in a hurry to let Haruz carry out this ceremony because she had a little trick up her sleeve. In Wonde, once the teacher-student relationship was established, it was not so easy to remove it. But fortunately, Brando did not care about this. If Princess Griffine knew that her Mr. Knight in front of her only wanted to use her brother as an experiment, she would probably stab him to death in this carriage. Unfortunately, both of them had their own little plans and did not notice the other's conspiracy for a while. The carriage soon arrived at its destination, the gate of a manor located in the Pasha Road area. Because the reconstruction of the Anderla Cathedral was far from complete, Archbishop Wood had been temporarily staying here for the time being. Princess Griffine and Brando both heard that this place should have belonged to House Cypher and Ampere Seal before, but neither of them were petty people and did not particularly care about it. The carriage stopped at the gate of the courtyard. Apparently, Wood had long been prepared to welcome the arrival of Her Royal Highness. Soon, a servant opened the way for them and led everyone into the courtyard. As soon as they got out of the carriage, Amandina hurriedly pulled the Roman to the front, and Her Royal Highness also took a step ahead, leaving only Brando and Prince Haruz at the back. This was actually a tradition, and Her Royal Highness understood that as a teacher, Brando must have something to say to his new student. But what she admired was that Brando's assistant was so smart and capable that she reacted one step ahead of her. The etiquette of these upper-class nobles was not well understood by the average person. Even in half of the noble families, very few people paid attention to it. Thinking of this, she could not help but look at Amandina a few more times. On the other hand, Brando did have something to say to Haruz. But as soon as he got out of the carriage, he saw Prince Haruz walking alone at least 2 or 3 meters away from him, as if he was a scourge. But the little prince still understood basic etiquette and did not dare to overstep, walking side by side with him. Brando looked at the prince walking with his head down with some amusement. Of course, he knew what the other party was afraid of. Your Highness Haruz. Haruz was startled and looked up at him. How? Teacher? Her Royal Highness still doesn't know? Brando asked. Haruz's face turned white. Teacher. Who taught you? Brando asked. He was, of course, talking about the little prince's practice of black magic. He did not mention it in front of Her Royal Highness at the time, 1 because he wanted to leave something to be used against him, and 2 because he did not want things to get out of hand. It was, of course, a matter of course in Madara for the crown prince of a country to practice black magic. But in Erewhon, a kingdom ruled by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was a big deal. Brando's first thought was a conspiracy, but he did not rule out other possibilities. First, he needed to get an answer from Haruz. But Haruz shook his head vigorously. No one taught me. Of course, this did not sound like the truth. However, Brando was puzzled to see that the little prince's face was red, and it did not look like he was lying. He was slightly startled, wondering if it was really as he had expected. He asked curiously, What the hell is going on, Haruz? Now that I am your teacher, you must answer my questions truthfully. I can promise not to tell your sister. This sentence obviously had a magical effect on Haruz. The boy raised his head and glanced at Brando weakly, as if he was a little skeptical, but in the end, he mustered up the courage to ask, Really? I keep my word, even Her Royal Highness believes me. Do you believe me? Brando replied somewhat shamelessly. He couldn't help but want to scratch his face, feeling that he was blushing a little. But anyway, it was just coaxing a child, so he just pretended not to hear it. Haruz thought about it and nodded honestly. Actually, I don't know why, teacher. Huh? Brando was stunned. This question was almost the same as not answering. But he heard some clues and hurriedly asked. You don't know why? What's going on? I don't know if that counts as magic. Did you secretly go to the royal library? Brando immediately asked. Haruz was slightly startled, looked at him a little fearfully, and nodded. Sure enough, Brando understood and asked again. You read the books inside? He nodded again. You imitated the things inside? Yes. He answered carefully. How many times? Only once. Please don't tell my sister, Count. Haruz hurriedly begged in a small voice. In his opinion, Brando was already close to a demon. He couldn't imagine how this count guessed all this. He had accidentally entered one of those forbidden areas before leaving the royal city, and it was only that one time, and he thought that no one knew about it. He couldn't help but look at Brando with some fear. Brando also looked at his new student. He could already be sure that some of the things said on the forum might be true. P.S. Happy New Year, everyone. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 668. Lord Archbishop. Edessa walked through a corridor and saw the former Archbishop of Ampere-Seal holding a pair of scissors and trimming the flowers in the courtyard. The old man was wearing a long robe and had his back to her. He bent over and put his head close to the emerald leaves. He looked absorbed. It wasn't until she spoke that Wood was slightly startled and turned his head. He smiled slightly. Edessa, you're here. Edessa bowed and asked, Yes, Lord Officiator. May I know why you are looking for us? Wood put away the scissors, turned around, and put a cut flower branch on the stone table in the courtyard. Edessa saw his silver-gray eyebrows stretch and said to her, Go and call your master. Tell him that if he wants to see that person, it's today. The maid stood there in a daze, as if she hadn't reacted for a while. But after a while there was a glimmer of surprise in her eyes. Lord Archbishop, you don't have to thank me on behalf of your master, Edessa. Wood waved his hand. I didn't promise you anything. He fought for this opportunity himself. But whether you can persuade Her Royal Highness and that person, I'm afraid it will ultimately depend on your own efforts. Only you will give us a chance, Lord Archbishop. Then hurry up and get ready, Wood replied. Edessa nodded hurriedly. She bowed sincerely to the former Archbishop of Ampere-Seal, and then retreated. Wood watched her leave the courtyard and disappear at the other end of the corridor. The old man sighed and picked up the scissors again. But it was at this time that the sound of rustling footsteps came from the other side of the corridor. He was slightly startled and stopped what he was doing again. The attendant led Brando and the princess through the corridor. The sunlight penetrated through the neatly trimmed walls of flowers and trees outside, leaving a zebra-like light pattern on the floor of the corridor. Mr. Brando, please take care of Haruz. Her Royal Highness saw Brando and her brother coming back from behind. She glanced at the silent Haruz and said softly. Brando also glanced at the little prince. In fact, Haruz was secretly looking at him. His dark gray eyes, which were different from his sister's, were full of anxiety and some pleading. Brando couldn't help but feel a little amused. In fact, he didn't say much. He just promised to keep it a secret for the little prince. Of course, he would keep it a secret, but not this. He knew that the real secret was that the little Prince of Erewhon might have some extraordinary talent, as described in the article on the forum in his previous life. Of silver. Of such talent. But now was not the time to make this secret public. On one hand, he did not want Haruz to become arrogant because of this, and on the other hand, he wanted to protect the little crown prince of Awin. In response to the princess's question, he lightly nodded. There was a slight light in front of them. They had reached the end of the fence surrounded by holly trees. The attendant took them around the corner of the cloister, and then Brando saw the former Archbishop of Ampere-Seal. In his eyes, Wood looked a lot thinner than he did half a month ago, but he was also much calmer. The old man seemed to have been waiting for them for a long time. When he saw them appear, he immediately smiled and said, Princess Griffine, Mr. Brando, you two are here. Then he looked back again. Miss Amandina, Miss Roman, His Royal Highness, everyone is well. Amandina nodded politely, and the little Roman on her side waved at the Archbishop. Only Prince Haruz stood a little timidly behind everyone. Princess Griffine looked at her brother and sighed. She bowed slightly to Wood. Archbishop, Her Royal Highness raised her head and said straightforwardly, We are here for the situation in the north. Wood was stunned and then he reacted. The Princess of Erewhon was so straightforward and showed a posture of not caring about the cost. She obviously wanted to tell him that she did not intend to compromise on this issue. Princess Griffine's attitude was not beyond his expectations, but it was because of this that he could not help but sigh. He understood the toughness of the princess from the beginning, but the Holy Cathedral of Fire thought that victory was in their hands. They did not expect to end up in such a huge trouble. Although the Holy Cathedral had given in many times on the issue of Erewhon, today was obviously the final highlight. If the princess could solve the problem in the north in one fell swoop, then the unification and even revival of Erewhon would only be a matter of time. Cruz was not happy to see a revived Erewhon, but there was no core conflict between the two after all. Compared with the Eagle Empire, Erewhon was just a small kingdom in a corner. The same was true for Wood. Compared with Cruz, he was first and foremost a faithful believer in the way of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so he once advocated the neutral attitude of the Holy Cathedral. Although until this attitude could not be maintained, he would still support all the actions of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. It turned out that the measures taken were wrong, but the former Archbishop of Amperseel now had to consider how to repair the losses caused by these mistakes, rather than questioning the course of action of the Holy Cathedral. He thought for a moment and did not speak. Brando on the side replied, "Archbishop, Erewhon is Erewhon who believes in the doctrine of the Holy Cathedral of Fire after all. The Holy War is imminent, and presumably the Holy Cathedral does not want to see its allies fall into civil strife. If there is Erewhon, then the Holy Cathedral of Earth and Madara will not be a problem for Cruz." Wood was stunned. His gaze immediately turned to Brando. This was the fourth time he had seen this young man, and it was this young man who had brought great trouble to the Holy Cathedral of Fire. However, Wood did not have any hatred for Brando. Instead, he admired him. "You mean the Holy Cathedral of Earth and Madara?" He raised his eyebrows and asked, "Mr. Brando, I heard that you were one of the first people to escape from Wuxia and experience that war. Don't you think that saying this is because of your prejudice against the Black Rose of Bramanto?" Brando smiled in his heart. Madara's changes could not be hidden from everyone, especially the two empires that bordered Saint-Tossel and Cruz. The Holy Cathedral of Fire must have known that Madara was ready to make a move. Otherwise, how could they have reacted so quickly in the First War of the Black Rose and immediately ordered them to retreat? But the abominable thing was that the Cruz people were obviously deliberately indulging those skeletons. In their eyes, Erewhon was just a more important chess piece, but it was not impossible to give him up. Judging from everything that happened in another period of history, the bottom line of the Cruz people should be that Erewhon should at least keep the part north of Amperseel. That was why Madara could progress so smoothly in the Second War of the Black Rose. Cruz people were wishful thinking of using Madara to divert the attention of Saint-Tossel. It was not until after the Third War of the Black Rose that Madara completely recovered. But at that time everything was too late. That was why there was a long and drawn-out war. Brando could not help but recall the war in the Alcash Mountains for a moment. He shook his head, but also saw through Wood's disguise. He replied, "If it was just prejudice, I wouldn't have mentioned the Black Rose of Bramanto. Don't tell me that Erewhon has fewer enemies?" He paused for a moment and said bluntly, "If Erewhon blocks the way north and west of Madara, those skeletons can only look for an exit in the east." Wood immediately closed his mouth. The old man obviously understood that the young man in front of him had seen through everything, including the plan of Madara and the plan of Cruz people. He took a deep look at Brando and said, "Madara has found the Mercury Staff, and the rise of Madara is inevitable. As far as I know, their emperor has gained great prestige in this war. I'm afraid that the time to unify this ancient country is imminent. At most, in a few years, the time will be ripe for the undead to invade the north and west. And in this time, can Erewhon complete the unification and have the ability to resist Madara's invasion?" He glanced at Brando and replied. Wood did not lie this time because he knew that in front of Brando, it was just a waste of their time. But before Brando spoke, he reminded him, "Don't forget that Erewhon has another war in the north. The Holy Cathedral of Earth has started the Holy Sword in advance because of the sword in your hand, Mr. Brando." Princess Griffine listened quietly. Amandina furrowed her brows as well. In fact, they had heard Brando talk about the threat of Madara, and the princess herself was aware of this, but they did not expect that time would be so tight. Especially when the half-fairy princess heard about the Mercury Staff, she could not help but take a breath and asked, "Mercury Staff, is that rumor true? Is it really Loki's Mercury Staff?" "That's right." Wood nodded. "How is this possible? Why didn't the Holy Cathedral of Fire tell us this in advance?" Princess Grafine could not help but be a little angry. She questioned, "Isn't Erewhon also a country under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Be it the royal family of Corvado or the royal family of Cipher, they have been loyal to the doctrine of the Holy Cathedral of Fire for generations because we believe that the Flame King can uphold justice and integrity. But Archbishop Wood, what do you take us for? Because the people of Cruz do not believe that Erewhon can resist Madara's invasion, and they are unable to mediate with the Holy Cathedral of Earth, Saint Tossel, and Madara at the same time, so I'm afraid that they have to give up part of their interests in Erewhon, so that they can divert Madara's undead to the Wind Elves, Your Highness," Brando replied. Princess Grafine stared at Archbishop Wood angrily, and Archbishop Wood was also a little embarrassed. He did not know why this young man always seemed to be able to see through their plans at a glance. He coughed and replied, "Actually, it's not exactly like that, but what Mr. Brando said is not unreasonable. The Holy Cathedral is not omnipotent, and the Cruz Empire also has many enemies. In the end, the people of Erewhon still have to save themselves. If Erewhon can resist Madara's invasion, we may not give up our interests here. I'm sure you can understand this." The princess took a breath, calmed down and nodded. "I understand, but now Archbishop Wood, you have seen it too. The people of Erewhon have such a wish. Does the Holy Cathedral of Fire not support this?" "No," Wood shook his head. "Your Highness, I'm sure you understand. The Holy Cathedral is also divided into many factions, and not everyone supports you. Whether you can get the support of others depends on how you plan to solve this problem. There are many deep-rooted aristocratic forces in the north of Erewhon, and you can't expect them to sit still and wait for death. But the problem now is not that I expect them to sit still and wait for death, but that they want me to sit still and wait for death." Her Highness pursed her lips and replied coldly, "The aristocrats in the north are ready to move, and each wants to be independent. On this issue, I will never compromise with them. If they want a war, I can only give them a war. But I want to know, whose side will the Holy Cathedral stand on?" She raised her head and looked at Wood. In fact, she knew in her heart that if the Holy Cathedral did not stand on the north side, a large part of the aristocrats in the north might choose to compromise with her. But Wood shook his head. "Your Highness, I can stand on your side. But this doesn't mean anything, you should understand very well. Besides, I'm not the Archbishop of Ampere Seal now. The Holy Cathedral will not give up its influence in the north." This was like a dead end, but there was always a solution to the problem. Brando looked at Wood and suddenly said, "So you have a way to solve this problem, right, Archbishop Wood? Why don't you tell me about it?" Wood was slightly startled and he looked at Brando. Brando continued, "I remember you told Amandina, my assistant, that you said you might be able to solve the chaos in the north." "No." Wood shook his head. "Mr. Brando, it's not me, but someone else who can do it." "Someone else?" Brando and Princess Grafine were both startled and couldn't help but stop and look at each other. "Who?" Her Highness asked. She really couldn't think of anyone who could solve the chaos in the north. Was it the High Priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Or His Majesty the Emperor of the Cruz Empire? Or the Buga people? The Silver Elves? She even thought of the dragons for a moment. But Archbishop Wood said, "That person also wants to see you, but before that, he needs to get your consent. For some reason you may not want to see him. Especially you, Princess Grafine." "Me?" Princess Grafine pointed at herself in confusion. "Why? Then who is it, Archbishop Wood?" "Princess Grafine," Archbishop Wood asked. "Are you familiar with your brother?" "My brother?" Her Highness suddenly called out softly. "P.S. Today's offering. I've been a little stuck recently, and I'm not in a good state, so I won't ask for votes. I'll ask again after I've made up for last month's outburst. Touch everyone. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 669. Levin, or Nessun. Cipher, the elder brother of Princess Grafine in history. Compared to his reputation before the civil war in Erewhon, after the war, the name of the eldest son of the king disappeared. Some said that he died in the chaos, some said that he was a puppet of Duke Cipher and the queen, and some said that the princess had once spared his life and let him live in seclusion in the mountains. But just like the historical truth behind these romantic folklore, The real story often made people feel that it was natural and unexpected. After Wood's introduction, Brando and Her Royal Highness waited in the front yard for about a quarter of an hour. During this time, no one spoke, and only the sound of the Archbishop pruning the branches and leaves could be heard. Because no one could figure out the intentions of the Archbishop of Ampere-Seal, it did not seem wise to let a person with a sensitive identity like the eldest son of the king appear in front of everyone. Her Royal Highness may not want to see her brother, and the latter was their enemy not long ago. Would he really be willing to help them? Although it was possible, there must be some kind of condition. Brando could not guarantee that Her Royal Highness would be willing to compromise with her enemy. But after a while, he heard light footsteps coming from behind the wall of holly trees. Everyone turned around and saw a maid leading a noble youth around the wall of leaves decorated with shrubs, appearing in front of him and Her Royal Highness. Although he had never seen him before, Brando immediately realized that this might be the prince in history. The other party's attire could be said to be not gorgeous. A simple military uniform, lavender, with a long cape that hung down to the green meadow and blended into the afternoon sun. He looked like a knight with a certain amount of assets in Bragg's, Magetan or Fort Kirkle, rather than an arrogant crown prince. The young man had a sword hanging from his waist, but it was not an exquisite shelf. It was a real cavalry sword, and the leather on the hilt was so worn that it did not seem to be a royal item. But it was not easy to judge that the owner of the sword was a master swordsman, because there was a pair of tightly closed eyes on that calm face. Long eyelashes drooped softly, as if the person was asleep or perhaps blind. His Royal Highness was very handsome, even dignified, but he was blind. A blind person obviously could not practice swordsmanship, and it was hard to imagine that he would be involved in a series of complex conspiracies, let alone become the king of Erewhon. Brando could not help but glance at Her Royal Highness beside him, and the princess looked very surprised. A trace of hesitation flashed in her eyes, but she still asked, "Brother Levin, your eyes?" Her tone was a little hesitant and surprised. "It's just a small matter, don't mind it, Grafine." Prince Levin didn't seem to mind and smiled indifferently. "But after losing my eyes I can see more widely, and people are often deceived by everything they see." He added, "Grafine, after Winter Castle we haven't seen each other for nearly 10 years. You should be 17 years old this year. And you must be much taller and more beautiful than then. Recently I have often heard people talk about you." His tone was very casual, as if he was really talking to his sister, not an enemy. Although, in a sense, his awkward identity today was caused by this little sister of his. Princess Grafine was silent for a moment, then said, "That's all in the past, brother. You have done a lot of wrong this time. The kingdom, father, the people, everyone will not forgive you, and everything will eventually be on the right track. I will not shirk my responsibility, but as a son, I must support my mother. Even now she has failed, Duke Cypher has been defeated and died, and I have become a prisoner. Grafine, you must think that I am resentful, but that is not the case. I am not here today to ask for forgiveness. I hope you understand that. No matter how the situation changes, I am still a member of the royal family of Erewhon." Levin lowered his eyelids and smiled. "Then you mean—" Princess Grafine was slightly startled, and she looked at Brando with a little doubt. Brando also frowned, guessing the prince's intentions. He pondered about the historical Levin. Or Nessun. What kind of person was Cypher? There were all kinds of rumors about him, but there were very few positive descriptions of the prince. At least before this, he had never known that the prince was blind, and it did not seem like he had recently lost his sight. What kind of character did such a prince have? Was he headstrong and self-opinionated, or was he a man of great talent and strategy? All the legends in history did not count. At least from the other party's current performance, the prince was obviously not a simple guy. And it was hard to say whether the other party was involved in the conspiracy between Duke Cypher and the Queen. But in any case, the other party's identity was very sensitive at this time. He was the only son of the Queen and Oberg VII, the only qualified successor of House Cypher. Presumably, the other party should also understand this. What else could the other party's purpose be other than a deal? But the key was the content of the deal. What did the prince's eldest son want? If he wanted to inherit House Cypher again, such an idea was a bit too naive. But since the prince's eldest son said that he did not expect to be forgiven, then presumably he would not make such a naive request. Brando raised his head. At this time, the maid beside Levin whispered something to the prince. He saw the prince turn his head and smile at him. "Is this Mr. Brando? I have heard of your deeds. Your performance in the Battle of Amperseal is already worthy of being a hero. Even the late King Eric was no better." Brando glanced at Princess Grafine and saw that there was not the slightest displeasure on the half-elf girl's face. Instead, there was a look of approval. He turned his head and replied calmly, "Your Royal Highness is too kind. The hero of Amperseal is not one person, and it's not that exaggerated. Everyone was just saving themselves." "I deeply agree. It is precisely because they know how to save themselves in struggle that civilization has continued to this day. The history of mankind and other intelligent races is itself a heavy epic. The appearance of thousands of heroes is not accidental, but a necessity." Levin smiled and nodded, which made Brando inadvertently notice that the prince had long shining dark black hair that draped over his shoulders like a waterfall. This hair color was very rare among Erewhon, with a touch of dark purple flowing between the strands. "Brother." Princess Grafine interrupted this mutual flattery. This was not what she wanted to hear. "Archbishop Wood said that you have a way to solve the chaos in the north. Are you going to use this to make a deal with me?" The prince's eldest son stopped and then nodded seriously. "Exactly. You should understand that this is impossible." Princess Grafine frowned, but her words were immediately interrupted. Prince Levin smiled slightly and said, "I understand, Grafine, but you guessed wrong. I don't want to use this as a condition in exchange for anything. I want the two of you to listen carefully to my thoughts. How about it?" "Brother, your thoughts?" The princess was slightly startled. Levin nodded, but then said to Wood, "Lord Archbishop, can I be alone with the princess and Mr. Brando for a moment?" Wood held the scissors in one hand and stopped. He glanced at the prince's eldest son, then nodded and put down the scissors. He said to Grafine and Brando, "Your Royal Highness, I more or less know some of your brother's ideas. Although they are a bit extreme, it is still a solution. At least at this juncture, you may be able to calm down and think about it." With that, the former Archbishop of Amperseal gently tidied up his robe and walked out of the courtyard. The princess frowned slightly as she listened. She watched Wood leave and turned back. "So brother, what exactly do you think?" she asked. "Grafine, as an enemy not long ago, you must be very suspicious of my intentions, right?" Levin did not answer directly, but asked. His tone sounded casual, as if he was joking with a friend. But this question sounded a little stupid. It was natural to be suspicious. Not to mention enemies, even strangers would be suspicious of each other. Brando knew that the prince was probably not a fool. He obviously had his intentions for saying this, so he just waited quietly for the following answer. The princess obviously understood this, but she still nodded. "Personally, I know what you are like, and I am willing to believe you, Brother Levin. But from our standpoint, you should also understand that politics does not tolerate personal feelings and weakness." "Yes, but in fact you may be mistaken about something. There is no conflict of interest between us, and even from a certain standpoint, we should stand together, Grafine and Mr. Brando," the prince's eldest son suddenly said. The courtyard quieted down. The princess was silent. She frowned deeply and looked at the man who should be her brother in name. "Brother Levin, do you think you can gain our trust by saying this?" This sentence was actually Brando's idea, but he was slightly surprised that Princess Grafine used "we" instead of "me." "No, this is not a lie." The prince's eldest son smiled slightly. "Grafine, you want to solve the chaos in the north. Nothing more than to end the civil strife in this kingdom, and eventually unify the country. Weren't you the ones who caused the division of the kingdom?" Grafine replied coldly. "Is that so?" Levin asked rhetorically. Was Erewhon a unified and stable kingdom before House Cipher rose up? The prince's eldest son suddenly raised his head. Although he could not see, it still gave the illusion of being watched. That kind of gaze seemed to be tangible, and his gaze swept over everyone present. "Grafine, you know this very well in your heart. Do you still remember what I told you before?" Her Royal Highness pursed her lips. Brando saw that her slender eyebrows were almost twisted together. He knew that Grafine and her brother in name had met once in their childhood, when Grand Duke Erek forced Oberg VI to change the defense decree during the year of the astrologer. At that time, Her Royal Highness went with her father to Wintercastle, where she met her brother. However, the historical records of this experience were only a few hurried words, and it was obviously impossible to record the conversation between the two children. However, Brando knew very well that there was nothing wrong with what the prince's eldest son was saying now. Had Erwin ever been unified? Perhaps. Since King Erek integrated the entire southern territory, Erwin had become a unified kingdom. But since the late king left this world, the Cipher dynasty ended, the Lionheart sword was lost, and the majesty of the royal family declined day by day. Even during the Renaissance era, with the existence of Sword St. Darius and Tulman, the central government's rule over the local areas was still very weak. And after Grand Duke Erek forced Oberg VI to change the defense decree, the kingdom's unification only existed in name. Since when had Erwin ever been unified? As the kingdom gradually fell apart, the majesty of the central royal authority was no longer able to restrain the disintegrating parts of the kingdom. And this was all that Her Royal Highness wanted to change. Grafine, Mr. Brando, do you only want to return the kingdom to the way it was before father was still alive? The prince's eldest son continued. If that's the case, what's the point of changing the names Cipher Corvado? This isn't your idea, is it? Brando and Her Royal Highness fell silent at the same time, because this was their goal. The source of the discord between the northern nobles and you, and the source of Grand Duke Erek's betrayal, Grafine, stems from the understanding of your true ambitions. You want to carry out reforms like Cruz and Saint-Tassel, and try to turn Erwin into a true centralized kingdom. If you succeed one day, it will undoubtedly be a nightmare for the powerful people today. Levin replied. No one will give up their interests so they can't support you. No. There will always be some people who support me, such as the Highland Knight, and those who still believe in the ideals of the late emperor, Princess Grafine replied. And then? Maybe you can also count those bankrupt knight and homeless people. Maybe you can succeed, Grafine. But don't forget, you don't have much time left. The prince's eldest son calmly analyzed. Erwin's enemies don't just come from the inside. This sentence pierced Brando's heart like a sharp thorn, and he couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Yes, for Erwin, reform might be inevitable, but at the same time, Erwin's enemies were not only the weak nobles. Seizing every minute and second was what he had been doing all along. Her Royal Highness raised her head. Then what can you do, brother? The prince's eldest son fell silent. After a short while, he replied softly, It's very simple. Let me become the king of Erwin, Grafine. P.S. After a long time of being stuck, I went out to play for a few days and found inspiration again. Sigh, it's really difficult. Also, meow, this time I'm not joking with you, just you wait, Humph. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 670. The courtyard was eerily quiet for a moment, except for Amandina, who softly let out a short ah, and the merchant lady who was looking around. Princess Grafine stared at her brother as if she was staring at an object, the look on her face so cold that no one dared to speak. Brando even quietly clenched the hilt of his sword under his coat with one hand, staring at the brother and sister's every move. He was a little suspicious that the eldest prince was mentally deranged because of the shock, but no matter what the situation was, he could guarantee that as long as the other party dared to have the slightest ill intention, he would dare to send the black blade of Halran Gaia into the other party's heart before that happened. As for the identity of the eldest prince, this kind of thing had no meaning in Brando's eyes. But the king's eldest son did not do anything. He stood calmly at the center of everyone's sight, his long hair hanging down naturally, his eyes closed, and there was not a trace of nervousness in his expression. It was as if he had just greeted them with an extremely ordinary greeting. Good afternoon. And not please give me the throne. Give me a reason, brother. Finally, the princess used such a voice to break the dead silence, like the sound of water dripping into the bottom of a well. But her face seemed to be covered with a layer of ice. The reason is simple, Grafine, the eldest prince said calmly. Because you need time to unify the southern territory. South of Ampierseal you can find many supporters. Mr. Brando, the Count of Tonnagel, may soon replace Count Ranner's position. There are also Duke Anthony and Duke Vero, who are not so greedy for power. The Highland Knight will also stand on your side because of Mr. Brando. With a unified southern territory, the North will no longer be your obstacle. Then what about you? Princess Griffine asked. Will you become the king of the North? You need someone to help you go back on your words without hurting the dignity of the royal family. Not only that, compared to you, the nobles in the North will accept me more easily, because House Cipher has natural leadership over them. In addition, Griffine, there is a war waiting for us in the North, and I can be your natural shield. A unified South and a war-torn North, it's clear to you who will win and who will lose, right? Brando's heart trembled slightly. He couldn't help but raise his head, as if he wanted to reevaluate this heroine's eldest son. Her Royal Highness was doing the same thing as her. She raised her head and asked seriously, "If this is a lie, it's too clumsy, brother. There will be a war between the North and the South, but it depends on when it happens. You and I both know very well, Griffine. Even if the North has an incomplete Black Blade Squad and a disobedient White Lion Legion, it is impossible for them to defeat the South." Levin replied calmly. Then he listened, as if to make sure that Archbishop Wood had gone far away. Will the Holy Cathedral of Fire allow a civil war to break out in Erewhon under such circumstances? I won't. They hope that you can make such a compromise with the North. It would be best if Erewhon can maintain the status quo, just like what happened after the Year of the Astrologer. But what if you have the absolute strength to sweep the North? Before they have time to protest. The dead silence was like dust settling in the courtyard, making all other sounds lie motionless on the ground. With all due respect, Brando finally couldn't help but speak. He asked as if he had been thinking for a long time. Your Royal Highness, although the Queen and Duke Cipher treat you as a puppet, as far as I know, you are actually involved in this game behind the scenes? Levin suddenly turned his head and looked in the direction of the voice. His sword-like eyebrows suddenly converged, and his whole person seemed to have suddenly become taller. You are better than I thought, Mr. Brando. I am very glad that I am not your enemy. Can you tell me how you came to this conclusion? Was it a guess or intuition? None of them. It was just that the predecessor planted the tree, and the successor enjoyed the shade. In the history of the previous life there were only a few words about His Royal Highness, and no one even said clearly about his whereabouts. However, curious players were very good at making groundless accusations, and there were many articles about analyzing Levin Ornstein-Cipher's character and life experience. Some of them were groundless, some were guesses, and some were rumors, but as long as this information was linked to the real eldest son of the king in front of him, the conclusion was very simple. Because of ambition, an ambitious person would not be willing to just be a pawn. Brando felt that he had never been so rational for a moment, as if he had been blessed with good fortune. All the speculations he had seen about His Royal Highness in the past had become the basis for his speech at this moment. It was as if he was standing on the shoulder of a giant. He raised his head and calmly said, "Since you can find Archbishop Wood in such a desperate situation and fight for a chance of survival, how could you really be at the mercy of others? It's wonderful, but it's true." The eldest son sighed. "I have stopped some things within the scope of my power. I am happy to see some of my mother's actions succeed, but I don't necessarily agree with her methods. Besides, everyone has self-interest in their hearts, and I don't think this is a sin," he replied. Her Royal Highness wanted to speak, but she suddenly stopped. She glanced at Brando and motioned for him to continue. Brando understood her trust and asked, "So what is your self-interest and whose side are you on?" I said, "We are on the same side. I want to be the king of the North, and you need me to be your barrier in the North." The eldest son's expression was calm, but Brando carefully observed the changes in his expression, and he had an intuition that the prince had not revealed all his true feelings. He subconsciously looked to the side and happened to see Levin Ornstein maid frown slightly. She seemed to want to say something, but the eldest son reached out and stopped her. "All this is just a bubble. You know very well your end. Is it worth it to sacrifice your life just to be the king of the North for a year or so? Brother." Princess Griffine finally couldn't help but speak. The eldest son laughed and replied, "Griffine, have you ever tasted the feeling of not being able to control your own fate? I swear one day I will control my own path, even if it's just for a minute or a second. Remember what I told you during the winter hunt? Erwin is a black forest. You said that if you were that wolf, your choice would be the same. Princess Griffine suddenly thought of the clip that had sunk into the snow and the bloodstains that stained her vision red. In the year of the astrologer, the scene of the biting cold wind blowing across the plateau was still chilling. Even if I have to bite off my own leg, I want freedom because the wilderness is my home, Levin replied, revealing his white teeth. Besides, I may not necessarily fail. Although the north is full of difficulties, there is always a glimmer of hope. Looking for a chance to survive in a desperate situation is what I am best at. Griffine, if you can't beat me, I will beat you mercilessly. Like you, I will never allow Ampere Seal to be divided for long, not even for a day. His cold voice echoed in the front yard. Even the merchant girl was startled. She turned around and stared at the madman with wide eyes. The eldest son of the king did seem crazy, but at least he was an elegant madman. He bowed to his sister, and no one could find any fault with it. Her Royal Highness thought for a while with a cold expression before calling out to him. Do you think I won't dare to kill you? Yes. But I won't agree to your request. And then? The eldest son of the king wasn't surprised and asked with a smile. Her Royal Highness looked at him quietly. 2 carriages filed out of the manor, and many people were waiting in the courtyard to board the carriages. He didn't tell the truth. As Amandine boarded the carriage, she reminded her lord in a low voice. At least he didn't tell the complete truth. I know you mean that part. As usual, Brando helped Amandine into the carriage. This action made him look different from ordinary people. Brendel ignored the strange gazes from the servants and raised his head to ask, "What's the matter?" "I don't know, but I feel that he is hiding something." Intuition. Intuition? Intuition is also a kind of experience, my lord. Amandine replied seriously. Brando thought about it and felt that it made sense. He turned around and looked at the other carriage. The emblem on the carriage was dark and almost indiscernible. He had the same doubts in his heart. His Royal Highness was definitely the calmest person he had ever met since he transmigrated. Such a person, it was unlikely that he would tell the complete truth. But the key was what he was hiding. He turned around again and pinched the tip of the Roman's nose, causing the latter to fall back with a cry. Then he boarded the carriage and greeted the young prince and the cold-faced princess before sitting down next to the Roman. Princess Griffine frowned, as if thinking about something. Brando was probably the only one present who understood her thoughts. But he did not say much, just lifted the curtain and looked out the window. Outside the window, the scenery of Ampere Seal was gradually falling into dusk. From today onwards, Levin Ornesen Cipher, her brother, was no longer the crown prince of the House of Covardo. Under the joint appointment of the princess and the Holy Cathedral, he would have a legal new title, the new head of the House of Cipher. This new Grand Duke would be appointed to prepare the north for the war with the Lion's Mane people. But in fact, he was promised to be the king of the north. Everyone would know. Although all this had not been finalized, Brando could already guess what Her Royal Highness's answer would be. It looked like a compromise from the royal party. But only a few people knew the truth. Perhaps some people would think that Her Royal Highness should be tougher, but perhaps some people would think that this was a more mature political approach. But what really puzzled Griffine was that her brother looked so confident. No one knew if they had made the wrong choice. But in Brando's opinion, the result was actually not bad. What Erwin needed was not a righteous title but time. If he was given a little more time, he would have the ability to save the kingdom. And now what the eldest prince gave them was exactly what he dreamed of. As long as the nobles in the north were no longer tempted, the princess would be able to free up her hands to clean up the mess in the south. More importantly, 3 years of peace. After 3 years, the enemies that Erwin could face would no longer be limited to the chickens and dogs in front of him. The king's eldest son had his own plans, and so did Brendel himself. Valhalla was the cornerstone of all of this. He was incomparably certain of this. He took one last look at the golden sunset outside the window. In that direction, there was a line of flashing seaside, as if he could see the spectacular scenery of the loop of trade winds through the golden clouds. Then he put down the curtain and stopped thinking about these things. As for what the eldest prince really wanted, such history would be left to the future to judge. At least for Brando. P.S. There is one more update. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 671. Most of the things that happened after Princess Griffine and Brando left the Wood Mansion could be predicted. The king's eldest son's succession to the position of Duke Cypher seemed to symbolize another compromise between the royal family and the local government. Such compromises were repeated in the history of the kingdom. Since the Year of Thunder, the power of the local government had become increasingly strong, eventually forming a vicious cycle. History seemed to be repeating itself, but in any case, at least with the intervention of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the appeasement of the king's eldest son himself, the turbulence in the north calmed down for a while and became calm again. In private, it was said that the nobles were celebrating a rare victory after the Battle of Ampere Seal, and the local atmosphere was foul as if the kingdom had returned to the days before and after the year of the astrologer. There seemed to be signs of banditry in the local areas again, and the merchants complained, but under all this surface, changes were quietly going on in the dark. Brando understood that Her Royal Highness could not sit still and allow Prince Levin to grow in the north, even if they had a secret agreement, even if he was her brother in name. But there was no room for personal feelings in politics, not to mention that the Holy Cathedral of Fire did not want to see signs of division between the north and south of Erewhon. At least before the end of the Holy War, the people of Cruz hoped that the ancient kingdom could maintain a semblance of stability. But that was only on the surface. In addition to these reasons on the surface, there was a more direct conflict of interest that determined this. Because in the north, in addition to the fixed territory of House Cypher, there was also the territory of the royal family of Covardo itself, as well as many areas such as Yenbao and Yanalasu. For these complex spheres of influence, the princess's party was unlikely to give up. Therefore, as part of the exchange, Her Royal Highness regained control of the White Lion Legion as expected. But perhaps because the king's eldest son himself did not want to control such an army that was not loyal to him, since the reappearance of the sacred Lionheart sword, there was a loud voice within the White Lion Legion that leaned towards the princess's side. This point was slightly different from what happened in history. In another period of history, until Freya fully controlled the White Lion Legion, the White Lion Legion did not really identify with the royal faction. But this time, Old White Lion, who had lost 2 army commanders, had clearly lost his original drive. Breton, Jocko, and Enrique, who had escaped from the Battle of Ampere Seal, were ordered to head to the north to take over the new legion. The new legion commander was the eldest grandson of the Lion who had died in the Battle of Ampere Seal. However, Brando knew that this unlucky fellow would not be able to stay in this position for long. Everyone understood that there was only one person who could lead this army. It was Freya, who held the Lionheart sword. But now was not the time. Maynard also removed Freya's name from the original list. The reason was that this girl from Butchie still needed more training. This was also Brando's opinion. In the future, she might have the ability to control an army, but she was still far from it. In his opinion, the White Lion Legion would be dormant for a long time until the officers under Carglass were formed. Only then would he have the ability to establish the White Lion infantry that truly reproduced the glory of that era. That was when the goddess of war would come into play. Before that, there were more important tasks waiting for this future goddess of war to complete. But compared to these things, some major events that happened on the table attracted the attention of ordinary people more. Especially when the Silver Folk finally intervened in the investigation of the Battle of Ampere Seal. At the request of the Bugas and the Silver Elves, the Holy Cathedral of Fire had to give up control of Ampere Seal. The mastermind behind all this was naturally Brando and a certain fairy lady. A human and a fairy pushed forward the most important event that happened between Erewhon and Cruz in the Year of the Sword in the eyes of ordinary people. In the middle of the month of the new moon from this day onwards, the port city would no longer be called autonomous, but would exist as Erewhon's trading port. As soon as this news spread, it shook the entire southern part of the continent of Wond. But no matter how the news spread, there was only one truth that would never change. That was, after several centuries, this sacred port finally returned to the arms of its ancient mother. That evening, Her Royal Highness made an exception and let Brando take her to the outer wall of the port for a walk. The half-fairy princess looked at the distant edge of the forest and the bay under the golden clouds of the setting sun. She just looked quietly without saying a word. Her gaze reached the end of the horizon, where the sun formed a golden thread. She was in the same position as her ancestor Yak was in 1,000 years ago. When they came down from the tower, the princess whispered a thank you to Brando. Her voice was so soft that it even made Brando suspect that he was hallucinating. But in any case, at least he remembered the sparkling eyes of Her Royal Highness when she looked into the distance. She must be very proud. Otherwise, those golden eyes that reflected the cloud's shadow wouldn't have hidden the excitement in them. She was not the king of Erewhon, but she was the princess who loved this land the most. Chaotic events surrounded the port, making a clamor like the waves of the sea, so much so that the various attitudes of the people over the past month had become a scryer to decorate it. And the trivial things that were interspersed with these major events became a moderating interlude. For example, the recovery of Garlock the Wanderer. When the chief mage of the kingdom, the hero of Ampere Seal, reappeared in front of the public, it caused a sensation in the city. After all, compared to the unknown Brando, Garlock's name was originally a legend in this kingdom. Ampere Seal held a day-long carnival that day, so much so that Her Royal Highness came to tease Brando and asked him if he was jealous. Brando was not jealous at all. He was more concerned about another matter, and that was Garlock had accepted Amandina as his apprentice as he had said before. According to the words of the great mage himself, it would be a pity if such a high talent was only willing to be immortal. Brendel could not agree more with him. But compared to this, he respected Amandina's opinion more. Fortunately, Amandina was not complacent. On the contrary, she had a desire to learn magic for a long time, but after her family went bankrupt, there was no opportunity and no time. In this way, Amandina nominally became Garlock's only successor. According to Her Royal Highness, she was likely to become a future court mage. And the third widely circulated incident of the month was also related to Garlock. The incident originated from a group of young people's curiosity about the legendary story of how the great mage escaped from the battlefield, but the person involved put on the airs of a master and refused to speak, which instead aroused everyone's curiosity. Soon, an absurd rumor spread among the city. It was said that Garlock was lucky enough to escape that day because he was hiding among a pile of demon corpses. Indeed, for a court great mage, such an experience was truly embarrassing. Therefore, out of some kindness, the port quickly banned similar rumors from spreading. However, there was one time when Brando met the great mage when he was passing through the front yard of the rebuilt Anderla Cathedral, and he accidentally heard the latter muttering to himself as he walked, "Damn feces, damn feces." Time seemed to fly by quickly, at least for Brando and everyone around him. The time spent in the port of Ampere Seal seemed to flash by amidst all these events. The gentle moon was like wood shavings floating in the river, swirling through the fingertips and disappearing from people's sight. The weather began to get hotter and hotter day by day. The storm off Ampere Seal gradually subsided, and the greenery in the mountains and forests became more and more breathtaking as time passed. It was as if the people in the port had not noticed the subtle changes around them, but the mountains and forests were already in full bloom, ushering in midsummer. The Nagas and the Silver Elves left Ampere Seal one after another, and the port seemed to have become deserted for a while. Brendel asked Naga to bring back the gratitude of the kingdom of Aween. Presumably, the Queen of Cold Dew, who had left an illustrious mark in history, would understand what he meant. Erewhon needed an alliance, and so did the Nagas under the shining sea. But there was another thing that made Brando's teeth ache a little. As promised, the Silver Elves took away their token, the precious ginkgo leaf. This loss was probably the most painful thing for Brando in this war. If it wasn't to save the princess, he wouldn't have wasted this precious opportunity. In his previous life, a player used this thing to exchange for an entire dragon's nest, and the value of the treasures in it was enough to buy the whole of Ranner Hill and rebuild it again. And Brando only used it to exchange for the nondescript title of Count of Tonagel. Although the princess tacitly agreed to his attack on Ranner Hill, but then again, Erewhon's power would be concentrated in the central sooner or later. In that case, his power as the actual lord would be taken back sooner or later. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that he was looking for trouble. But fortunately, the silver elves probably gave Medici face and didn't give him too much trouble. On the contrary, they stood firmly on his side from the beginning, and completely drove the tentacles of the Holy Cathedral of Fire out of Ampere Seal in the shortest time possible. From this point of view, it was worth the price of the ticket. But with the departure of the Silver Elves, the officials in the port of Ampere Seal inevitably felt that everything seemed to have become easier. The key point was that the disputes that often arose because of the differences in habits between humans and Silver Elves seemed to have disappeared without a trace. Everything seemed to have come to an end after entering the hot summer months, so Brando quickly understood that there seemed to be only one thing left in this port for him to complete. The date was moving forward methodically. Just like the date marked on an accurate timetable, the expected guest arrived on time on a sunny afternoon. It was a letter with a silver feather, and written in flying letters on the cover, to Mr. Brando. The same letter was also delivered to the princess's desk. Buga's envoy had arrived. Brando, look at me. A light voice pierced through the forest, as happy as a child. When Brando looked up, he saw a few beams of sunlight descending from the shade of the trees, falling on the dead leaves and moss, forming picturesque spots of light. Between these jagged rocks, there was a piece of dead wood, and the merchant lady stretched out her hands and walked unsteadily on it, as if she was very proud of her balance. Then she jumped down from the dead wood and landed in front of Brando and Amandina, showing off. How is it? Isn't it awesome? Super awesome. Brando sighed helplessly. Roman, aren't you tired? In the forest outside the port, there was a humid heat in the sultry heat, like the mist in a steamer. Everyone was sweating profusely, except for some of the more energetic guys. What annoyed him a little was that the fairy lady had told him that the Buga mages had specifically chosen a cool cloudy day. Now it seemed that either the silver folks' understanding of cloudy days had some problems, or the artisan mages' astrologers were simply unreliable. Brando looked back. Scarlet, Freya, Carglass, and even the Countess of Yenbao had been called over. The Countess and the Princess were whispering something behind him. Carglass was with the Tonagel youths as usual. The Shire and the Nightsong Tigers mercenaries were on guard outside, and only Scarlet sat alone under a poplar tree, reading a book with a red cover, her long ponytail hanging down to the moss. In fact, Scarlet's original literacy was not much, and could only be said to be far better than the average Highlander. Of course, most Highlanders were completely illiterate. But ever since Amandina became her teacher, this Highlander girl who did not like to talk seemed to be finding some quiet pleasure in reading more and more. It was just that reading Knight's novels all day long made Brando worried that she would eventually become like the Roman. He turned back to look at our merchant lady. She was already holding his arm and sitting next to him. It finally stopped for a while, and Brendel breathed a sigh of relief. But not long after, there was a rustling sound from the bushes in front of them. Everyone looked up and saw Makarov Oberway and Count Odin walking out from behind the bushes. They had obviously just arrived. Makarov first saw Princess Grafine beside Dilfari, and was slightly startled. He turned to Brando and asked, Mr. Brando, what guests are we meeting today, and why is the princess here? In fact, they had received the news a day before. Makarov first thought of the dragons behind Brando. It was because of the golden folk behind the princess that the royal faction was more firmly tied to the princess's chariot after the war. Of course, Fleetwood's death also dispelled the misunderstanding between both sides to a certain extent. No matter what, the chief court wizard of the kingdom was still Princess Grafine's teacher. But for Makarov, the last news he received was that the female dragon called Alaz had caused a ruckus in the port one day. After simulating the scene of a fire dragon attacking the city, she disappeared without a trace. Everyone thought that the terrifying dragon girl had left, but he didn't think so. He stubbornly insisted that she was hiding behind the scenes. And the young man called Brando, who had a special relationship with the dragons, was obviously the princess's greatest support. But he didn't know that the answer to his question was actually very simple for Brando. After listening to the story of the loop of trade winds, the bad-tempered little dragon girl had already run back to Tonagel to see her Valhalla. And today they were meeting another group of people. But before Brando could answer, the bushes were separated again. This time it was an old man in a silver robe. When he saw Brando, he was slightly startled before a familiar smile appeared on his face. I'm here to take a look at today's heroine on behalf of my old friend. I didn't expect to meet you again, little Brando. Damn. Brando almost jumped up. He thought that the people from Buga would be Tanya and Tolman. After all, they had a deeper relationship with the kingdom. But he never dreamed that it would be such a person. William Peaster, the Silver Storm, the leader of the Silver Alliance. He subconsciously turned around and saw the Princess, Makarov, and Oberway looking at him with a strange expression. It was as if they were looking at a legendary monster. The meaning in their eyes was obvious. Brando, who are you? P.S. This is the second update of the day. If you didn't see the first one, you can go back and read it. Don't miss it. 2 updates today. I'm a little short of 10,000. But it's not much, so I'm starting to make up for it. Touch everyone. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation.